Welcome to the complete chronicle of Morty Smith, an ordinary boy thrust into extraordinary circumstances, whose journey from anxious teenager to seasoned interdimensional traveler reveals the profound cost of growing up too fast in an infinite multiverse. Tonight we explore how innocence transforms under the weight of cosmic knowledge, how love persists despite betrayal, and how even the most damaged relationships can offer glimpses of genuine connection. Let this story of growth, trauma, and resilience carry you toward peaceful rest as we trace every step of Morty's evolution, from frightened grandson to someone who understands that family, however flawed, remains worth fighting for. The morning that would forever alter the trajectory of Morty Smith's existence began like countless others in the suburban mediocrity of his family's split-level home, with the familiar sounds of domestic dysfunction filtering through thin walls and the persistent anxiety that had become his constant companion since childhood. Morty lay in bed, listening to his parents argue about something trivial, yet somehow profound in its representation of their fundamental inability to communicate about anything that truly mattered, while his sister Summer prepared for another day of effortless social navigation that seemed as foreign to Morty as interdimensional travel would soon become. The teenage boy who shuffled toward the breakfast table that morning was unremarkable in every way that high school hierarchies measured significance: average height, awkward posture, a voice that still occasionally cracked despite his 14 years, and the kind of nervous energy that made him fidget constantly with whatever objects happened to be within reach. His brown hair fell across his forehead in a style that suggested more accident than intention, while his yellow shirt and blue pants represented the uniform of suburban anonymity that camouflaged him among thousands of other teenagers who navigated similar landscapes of social anxiety and academic mediocrity. But beneath Morty's unremarkable exterior existed a mind characterized by unusual empathy and emotional intelligence that his academic struggles had taught most adults to overlook or dismiss as irrelevant to his potential for future success. The boy who struggled with basic mathematics possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that enabled him to read the emotional undercurrents of family conversations with sophisticated accuracy, recognizing the deeper needs and fears that motivated his parents' surface-level conflicts, while remaining unable to articulate his insights in ways that adults would take seriously. The breakfast conversation that morning followed patterns that had become as predictable as they were depressing, with Jerry's attempts to assert paternal authority being systematically undermined by Beth's barely concealed contempt for his lack of ambition and professional achievement. Morty absorbed their antagonism with the passive resignation of someone who had learned that attempting to mediate between his parents only resulted in becoming the target of frustrations they were unable to direct effectively toward each other, while Summer maintained her typical teenage detachment from family drama that she considered beneath her social aspirations. The announcement that Rick Sanchez would be moving back into the house was delivered with the kind of casual indifference that families use to discuss major life changes they feel powerless to influence or control. But Morty's response to the news was complicated by memories that existed more as emotional impressions than concrete recollections of specific events or interactions. The grandfather he barely remembered had achieved almost mythical status in family conversations through references to his brilliance and unpredictability that made him seem more like a fictional character than a real person who would soon be sharing their living space. Rick's actual arrival that afternoon was simultaneously anticlimactic and overwhelming, as the man who shambled through their front door carrying a single duffel bag bore little resemblance to the legendary figure Morty had constructed in his imagination based on fragmentary family stories, and his own need for someone who might understand his sense of alienation from normal teenage concerns. The elderly scientist with wild grey hair and persistent alcohol breath seemed more like a homeless person than a genius whose return was supposed to somehow improve their family's emotional dynamics and practical circumstances. But Morty's initial disappointment in his grandfather's appearance and demeanor was quickly overshadowed by growing fascination with Rick's casual confidence and apparent indifference to the social conventions that governed most adult behavior in Morty's limited experience. The way Rick dismissed Jerry's attempts at establishing household rules while simultaneously charming Beth into compliance with his domestic arrangements suggested capabilities and understanding that transcended normal human limitations, even if the specific nature of those capabilities remained mysterious and potentially dangerous. The garage workshop that Rick established with remarkable efficiency became a source of endless curiosity for Morty, who found himself drawn to the strange equipment and incomprehensible projects that filled the space with sounds and smells unlike anything in his previous experience. The devices Rick constructed seemed to operate according to principles that violated everything Morty had learned about physics and chemistry in school, while the casual competence with which Rick manipulated exotic materials and energy sources suggested knowledge that exceeded what any individual human should be able to accumulate during a normal lifetime. Rick's initial interactions with Morty were characterized by the kind of dismissive tolerance that adults typically reserved for children, whose presence was annoying but unavoidable. But gradually Rick began to demonstrate interest in his grandson that went beyond simple politeness or family obligation. The questions Rick asked about Morty's interests and concerns revealed an analytical mind that processed information about human psychology with the same systematic thoroughness that he applied to technical problems, creating the impression that Rick was studying Morty as much as conversing with him. The first hint of Rick's true capabilities came during a conversation about Morty's struggles with mathematics homework that revealed not only Rick's casual mastery of advanced concepts, but also his ability to explain complex ideas in terms that made intuitive sense to someone with Morty's particular learning style and intellectual strengths. The patient way Rick guided Morty through problem-solving approaches that bypassed his usual anxiety and confusion suggested teaching abilities that had been developed through extensive experience with minds that operated differently from conventional academic expectations. But perhaps more significantly, Rick's approach to helping Morty with his academic difficulties was characterized by genuine respect for Morty's intelligence and potential that contrasted sharply with the condescending patience that most adults displayed when attempting to assist him with schoolwork. Rick treated Morty's questions as legitimate requests for information rather than evidence of intellectual inadequacy, while his explanations assumed that Morty was capable of understanding sophisticated concepts if they were presented appropriately, rather than dumbed down to accommodate presumed limitations. The transformation in Morty's self-perception that resulted from Rick's educational approach was gradual but profound, as he began to recognize that his academic struggles might be related to teaching methods and institutional expectations, rather than fundamental cognitive limitations that would prevent him from achieving intellectual competence in areas that interested him. The confidence that Rick's respectful guidance helped Morty develop extended beyond academic contexts to influence his social interactions and emotional self-regulation in ways that made daily existence noticeably less anxiety-provoking and overwhelming. Rick's integration into the family's domestic routines was accomplished with strategic precision that suggested extensive experience with managing complex human relationships and psychological dynamics, but his methods for achieving influence and control were so subtle and gradual that other family members remained largely unaware of how completely their decision-making processes had been reorganized around Rick's preferences and objectives. The way Rick maneuvered Jerry into positions of apparent authority while actually directing family policies revealed sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics that exceeded anything Morty had previously encountered. The first interdimensional adventure began not with dramatic revelation or careful preparation, but with Rick's casual suggestion that Morty might find it educational to observe some advanced scientific procedures that required an assistant with certain specific physiological characteristics that Morty happened to possess. The portal gun that Rick retrieved from his workbench looked like an elaborate toy until he activated it and opened a glowing green gateway to somewhere that definitely was not anywhere on Earth, while his matter-of-fact explanation of interdimensional travel was delivered with the same tone he might use to describe a trip to the grocery store. Morty's first step through a portal was simultaneously the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of his young life, as the familiar physical laws and environmental conditions that had defined the boundaries of his existence were replaced by alien landscapes that operated according to principles he could neither understand nor predict. The sensation of dimensional travel itself was indescribable, not painful, but profoundly disorienting in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and his place within cosmic structures he had never imagined. The planet they visited on Morty's first adventure was populated by beings whose casual cruelty and systematic exploitation of weaker species provided him with immediate education in forms of evil that exceeded anything he had encountered in human society or popular entertainment. The way Rick navigated these dangerous circumstances with apparent ease, while protecting Morty from the worst consequences of their exposure to alien hostility, demonstrated capabilities that confirmed his grandfather's status as something approaching a cosmic force, disguised as an eccentric, elderly human. But perhaps more disturbing than the alien violence Morty witnessed was Rick's casual attitude towards suffering and death that seemed unrelated to immediate threats to their own safety or mission objectives. The indifference with which Rick observed the torture and murder of beings who possessed obvious intelligence and capacity for suffering revealed a fundamental disconnect from normal human empathy that made Morty question whether his grandfather retained enough humanity to be trusted with the kind of power his technological capabilities represented. The seeds of Rick and Morty's codependent relationship were planted during these first shared adventures, as Morty's terror and fascination with interdimensional travel created emotional dependency on Rick's protection and guidance that transcended normal family bonds or educational relationships. The boy who had struggled to form meaningful connections with peers his own age found himself bonded to his grandfather through shared experiences that no other human in his reality could understand or relate to, creating isolation that made Rick's approval and companionship psychologically necessary for Morty's continued emotional stability. Rick's careful cultivation of this dependency was accomplished through strategic alternation between terrifying Morty with exposure to cosmic-scale dangers and then rescuing him with demonstrations of protective capability and genuine concern for his welfare. The cycle of crisis, followed by salvation, created psychological patterns that made Morty grateful for Rick's presence, while also making him unable to imagine navigating complex situations without his grandfather's superior knowledge and technological resources. The family's response to Rick and Morty's growing relationship was complicated by their inability to understand the true nature of the experiences that were bonding grandfather and grandson, while simultaneously creating barriers between Morty and everyone else in his life. The secrecy that Rick insisted was necessary to protect their interdimensional activities from government attention also served to isolate Morty from potential sources of alternative guidance or emotional support that might compete with Rick's influence over his psychological development. Beth's obvious satisfaction with her father's interest in Morty was based on her assumption that Rick's mentorship would provide her son with the kind of intellectual stimulation and male guidance that Jerry was incapable of offering. But her lack of awareness about the actual nature of Rick's educational methods prevented her from recognizing that Morty was being exposed to forms of trauma and moral complexity that no adolescent should be expected to process successfully without extensive psychological support and preparation. Jerry's growing resentment of Rick's influence over Morty was motivated more by jealousy about being displaced as a father figure than by genuine concern for his son's welfare. But his complaints about Rick's irresponsible behavior contained elements of valid worry about the psychological and physical risks that Morty was being exposed to through his participation in activities that remained mysterious, but obviously dangerous based on the state Morty sometimes returned home in after spending time with his grandfather. Summer's perspective on Rick and Morty's relationship was complicated by her own adolescent needs for attention and validation from family members, but her observations about changes in Morty's behavior and social functioning provided the most accurate assessment of how Rick's influence was affecting his psychological development and capacity for normal teenage relationships. The way Morty became increasingly distracted and detached from school activities and peer interactions suggested that his interdimensional experiences were creating cognitive and emotional demands that interfered with age-appropriate developmental tasks. The psychological transformation that Morty underwent during his first weeks of regular interdimensional travel was characterized by rapid acceleration of intellectual and emotional maturation that occurred without corresponding development of wisdom or judgment necessary for managing the knowledge and experiences he was accumulating. The boy who had struggled with basic social interactions was suddenly required to navigate complex moral situations that would challenge experienced adults, while his normal support systems remained unaware of the pressures he was facing. Rick's approach to Morty's education in interdimensional survival and cosmic awareness was characterized by the same sink or swim methodology that had presumably shaped Rick's own development during his years of multiversal exile and warfare. The assumption that Morty would either adapt to extreme circumstances or be eliminated by them reflected Rick's fundamental inability to recognize that his grandson lacked the emotional armor and psychological defenses that Rick had, developed through decades of trauma and systematic moral compromise. But despite the traumatic aspects of his early adventures with Rick, Morty also experienced forms of intellectual excitement and personal validation that had been completely absent from his previous existence as an overlooked and underestimated member of his family and school community. The recognition that he possessed capabilities and insights that enabled him to contribute meaningfully to their interdimensional missions provided Morty with self-confidence and sense of purpose that transformed his understanding of time, his own potential and value. The relationship that developed between Rick and Morty during this period was simultaneously exploitative and nurturing, as Rick's genuine affection for his grandson coexisted with strategic manipulation designed to ensure Morty's continued availability as an adventure companion and emotional anchor. The love that connected them was real, but was also contaminated by Rick's inability to separate his own psychological needs from Morty's developmental requirements, creating a dynamic that served Rick's interests while potentially compromising Morty's long-term emotional and moral development. As Rick's presence in the family became normalized and Morty's role as his preferred companion became established, the foundation was laid for years of increasingly complex adventures that would test both Rick's ability to protect his grandson from the worst consequences of interdimensional travel and Morty's capacity to maintain his essential humanity while being educated in cosmic truths that most beings were never meant to comprehend. The boy who had once worried primarily about talking to girls and passing math tests was about to discover that the universe contained forms of beauty and terror that would make his previous concerns seem like pleasant memories from a proscent, simpler time when the biggest dangers he faced were social, embarrassment, and academic failure. The transformation of Morty Smith from anxious teenager seeking romantic guidance into unwitting architect of global catastrophe began with what seemed like the most ordinary request imaginable: a grandson asking his brilliant grandfather for help with matters of the heart that had consumed his thoughts and dominated his emotional landscape since the moment he first laid eyes on Jessica in the hallways of Harry Herpson High School. The simplicity of Morty's desire to connect with the red-haired girl who represented everything he found beautiful and unattainable in his limited teenage universe masked the profound complexity of the forces he was about to unleash through his naive faith in Rick's ability to solve problems that required emotional intelligence rather than technological innovation. Rick's response to Morty's confession about his hopeless crush on Jessica was characteristically analytical and devoid of the kind of emotional support or practical guidance that normal grandfathers might provide when confronted with adolescent romantic struggles. But his immediate offer to create a technological solution to Morty's confidence problems seemed like a miraculous gift to a boy whose entire social existence had been defined by anxiety and self-doubt. The love potion that Rick presented as a simple confidence booster was described in terms that minimized its potential for causing harm, while maximizing its appeal to someone desperate enough to risk unknown consequences for even temporary relief from the psychological torture of unrequited attraction. The casual way that Rick dismissed Morty's concerns about the ethics and safety of using chemical manipulation to influence Jessica's emotions revealed the fundamental disconnect between Rick's cosmic perspective and normal human understanding of consent and autonomy. But Morty's desperation to experience even artificial romantic success overwhelmed his instinctive recognition that Rick's solution felt morally questionable. The internal conflict between Morty's basic decency and his overwhelming need to escape the prison of his own social inadequacy created psychological conditions that made him vulnerable to rationalization and self-deception about the true nature of what he was contemplating. The potion itself was a marvel of biochemical engineering that demonstrated Rick's casual mastery of sciences that most civilizations would require centuries to develop, but its sophisticated molecular structure masked design flaws that reflected Rick's fundamental inability to understand or predict the complex emotional and biological systems that governed human romantic behavior. The same intellectual arrogance that enabled Rick to crack the secrets of interdimensional travel also blinded him to the possibility that his theoretical knowledge might be inadequate for safely manipulating something as chaotic and interconnected as human brain chemistry and social dynamics. Morty's first use of the love potion on Jessica produced exactly the results that Rick had promised, transforming her from politely disinterested classmate into someone whose entire existence seemed suddenly focused on gaining Morty's attention and approval. But the artificial nature of her attraction was immediately obvious to anyone who had observed her normal personality and behavior patterns. The disconnect between Jessica's genuine character and her chemically altered responses created an uncanny valley effect that made their interactions feel simultaneously thrilling and deeply disturbing. as Morty experienced the validation he had craved while recognizing that it was based on fundamental violation of Jessica's autonomy and authentic self. The psychological complexity of Morty's response to the love potion's success revealed the sophisticated moral reasoning that coexisted with his desperate need for social acceptance and romantic validation. As he found himself simultaneously grateful for Rick's assistance and horrified by the implications of what they had done to someone he claimed to care about. The recognition that Jessica's affection was artificial rather than earned created cognitive dissonance that poisoned the very experience Morty had thought he wanted, transforming his romantic fantasy into a nightmare of guilt and ethical confusion that no amount of external validation could resolve satisfactorily. But the personal, moral crisis that the love potion created for Morty was quickly overshadowed by catastrophic, practical consequences that exceeded his worst fears about the potential risks of Rick's technological intervention in his romantic life. The airborne transmission that spread Jessica's artificially induced attraction throughout the school demonstrated Rick's characteristic failure to anticipate or prepare for secondary effects of his inventions, while his casual response to the escalating crisis revealed how completely his multiversal perspective had severed his connection to normal human concerns about collective welfare and social responsibility. The transformation of Harry Herpson High School into a battleground where every student and faculty member competed for Morty's attention, with increasing desperation and violence, provided him with direct education in the way that Rick's solutions to simple problems inevitably created complex disasters that affected innocent people who had never chosen to participate in their adventures or experiments. The speed with which normal social structures collapsed under the influence of chemically induced obsession demonstrated the fragility of civilization and the ease with which technological intervention could destabilize systems that seemed robust and permanent from the perspective of individual participants. Rick's response to the school-wide catastrophe was to compound the original problem through additional chemical intervention, rather than addressing the underlying issues his potion had created, revealing his fundamental inability to solve problems through methods that required acknowledgement of responsibility or consideration for consequences that affected people outside his immediate circle of concern. The cure that Rick developed was designed to neutralize the love potion's effects, but created secondary mutations that were arguably worse than the original chemical attraction, transforming the affected population into grotesque creatures whose humanity had been permanently compromised by Rick's casual experimentation. The escalation from local disaster to global pandemic occurred with terrifying speed as Rick's chemical interventions interacted with human biology and social systems in ways that his theoretical knowledge had failed to predict, creating cascading effects that spread across the planet faster than any conventional disease or natural disaster. The transformation of Earth's entire population into beings whose existence revolved around pursuing Morty with increasingly violent and desperate intensity provided him with cosmic-scale education in the unintended consequences of seeking technological shortcuts to emotional and social problems that required patience, maturity, and genuine human connection to resolve appropriately. Morty's psychological response to witnessing the destruction of human civilization was complicated by his recognition that the catastrophe had resulted directly from his own selfish desires and his willingness to accept Rick's morally questionable assistance, rather than dealing with his romantic problems through conventional means that respected other people's autonomy and dignity. The guilt that overwhelmed him as he observed the collapse of social institutions and the suffering of billions of innocent people created existential crisis that challenged his fundamental understanding of personal responsibility and the pound standing of personal responsibility. relationship between individual choices and collective consequences. Rick's casual attitude toward the global catastrophe he had created revealed the full extent of his psychological detachment from normal human values and priorities, as he treated the destruction of civilization as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy that demanded serious effort to develop solutions that might restore some semblance of normal existence for the surviving population. His primary concern was not the welfare of the billions of affected humans, but rather the practical challenge of protecting himself and Morty from the consequences of their actions, while maintaining their ability to continue their interdimensional adventures without interference from hostile authorities or vengeful survivors. The solution that Rick proposed to the problem of living on a planet where they had destroyed civilization was characteristically elegant in its simplicity and morally devastating in its implications, as he suggested that they simply abandon their ruined reality and relocate to a dimension where alternate versions of themselves had died in an unrelated accident. The casual way Rick presented dimensional abandonment as the obvious solution to problems they had created demonstrated his complete inability to accept responsibility for consequences that affected other people, while also revealing the extent to which his multiversal perspective had made individual realities seem disposable and replaceable rather than unique and valuable. Morty's initial resistance to Rick's abandonment plan was motivated by his intuitive recognition that fleeing to another dimension would represent ultimate moral failure and abandonment of any obligation to help repair the damage they had caused, but his practical inability to propose alternative solutions that might actually address the scale of destruction they had created left him vulnerable to Rick's arguments about the futility of guilt and the necessity of prioritizing their own survival over abstract moral principles. The internal conflict between Morty's desire to do the right thing and his recognition of their powerlessness to undo the catastrophe created psychological pressure that ultimately overwhelmed his resistance to Rick's escape plan. The process of locating a suitable replacement dimension required Rick to survey multiple realities where versions of themselves had died in circumstances that would allow them to assume their alternate selves' identities without creating obvious inconsistencies that might alert family members or authorities to their deception. The systematic way Rick evaluated potential replacement realities revealed his extensive experience with dimensional abandonment and identity replacement, while also demonstrating how completely he had instrumentalized the concept of personal identity and individual significance. The specific dimension that Rick selected for their relocation was chosen not because it offered opportunities for them to contribute positively to that reality's welfare or development, but simply because the deaths of their alternate selves had created convenient openings that they could fill without extensive preparation or complex deception. The arbitrary nature of Rick's selection criteria highlighted his inability to recognize that the people whose lives they were stealing had possessed the same fundamental worth and dignity as themselves, regardless of their identical appearance and similar life histories. Morty's first glimpse of their replacement dimension revealed a reality that was superficially identical to their original home, but subtly different in ways that emphasized the artificial nature of their new existence and the could-have-os that note impossibility of truly returning to the innocence and authenticity they had lost through their actions. The familiar faces and locations that should have provided comfort and continuity instead created uncanny valley effects that reminded Morty constantly that he was living a lie and inhabiting an identity that belonged to someone else who had deserved to live the life that Morty was now appropriating. The burial of their own alternate selves was perhaps the most psychologically traumatic experience of Morty's young life, forcing him to confront the physical reality of death and replacement in ways that made abstract philosophical questions about identity and continuity into immediate practical concerns that affected his ability to function in basic social situations. The sight of his own corpse rotting in a shallow grave created existential horror that exceeded anything he had experienced during their interdimensional adventures. While Rick's casual attitude toward the disposal of their dead counterparts revealed how completely his grandfather had abandoned normal human responses to mortality and the significance of individual existence, Rick's explanation of the burial process was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to describe routine laboratory procedures. But his instructions about the importance of completely covering the bodies and avoiding detection by neighbors revealed practical experience with corpse disposal that suggested this was not his first experience with replacing dead versions of himself. The systematic way Rick managed the burial process demonstrated planning and preparation that implied he had anticipated the eventual need for dimensional abandonment and replacement long before the love potion disaster had made it necessary. The psychological after-effects of the burial experience manifested in Morty as persistent anxiety about his own identity and the authenticity of his relationships with family members who had no knowledge that he was not actually the same person who had left their house that morning to attend school with his grandfather. The recognition that his parents and sister were interacting with someone they believed to be their son and brother while actually engaging with an imposter created forms of guilt and isolation that normal teenage therapy or support systems were completely inadequate to address. Rick's casual dismissal of Morty's trauma about the burial and identity replacement revealed his fundamental inability to understand or respond appropriately to normal human emotional responses to extreme circumstances. While his arguments about the philosophical meaninglessness of individual identity in an infinite multiverse were presented as objective truth rather than psychological defense mechanisms that protected him from confronting the moral implications of his own actions. The way Rick used intellectual frameworks to justify behavior that violated basic human decency provided Morty with early education in how superior intelligence could be weaponized to rationalize moral failures and avoid accountability for harmful choices. The family's reaction to Rick and Morty's return from their disastrous adventure was complicated by their complete ignorance about what had actually occurred during their absence, creating situations where normal expressions of parental concern and sibling interaction felt hollow and artificial to Morty, while seeming perfectly natural to family members who had no reason to suspect that anything significant had changed. The disconnect between Morty's internal experience of trauma and identity confusion and his family's expectations of normal teenage behavior created additional psychological pressure that compounded the isolation he was already experiencing as a result of keeping cosmic scale secrets. Beth's casual questions about how Morty had enjoyed spending time with his grandfather were particularly painful because they demonstrated her genuine care for his welfare, while also highlighting her complete inability to understand the true nature of the experiences that were shaping his psychological development and moral understanding. The maternal love that Morty had always taken for granted now felt like additional burden because it was directed towards someone his mother believed him to be, rather than the person he was actually becoming through his exposure to Rick's worldview and methods. Jerry's concerns about Rick's influence on Morty were motivated more by jealousy and resentment than by genuine insight into the psychological damage that interdimensional adventures were inflicting on his son. But his complaints about Rick's irresponsible behavior contained elements of truth that Morty found impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. The recognition that his father's criticisms of Rick were at least partially accurate created additional cognitive dissonance that made family relationships even more complex and emotionally exhausting to navigate. Summer's observations about changes in Morty's behavior and mood were more perceptive than their parents' assessments, reflecting the natural psychological sophistication that adolescents often develop in response to family dysfunction and emotional instability. Her questions about what Rick and Morty actually did during their time together were driven by genuine concern for her brother's welfare rather than simple curiosity. But Morty's inability to share the truth about their adventures meant that her attempts to provide support and understanding were inevitably frustrated by his necessary secrecy. The long-term psychological consequences of the love potion disaster and dimensional abandonment established patterns that would characterize Morty's relationship with Rick throughout their subsequent adventures. As he learned to accept moral compromise and identity, confusion as inevitable costs of maintaining his connection to his grandfather, and accessing the intellectual excitement and cosmic significance that their interdimensional travels provided. The boy who had once been motivated primarily by desire for romantic validation had been transformed into someone who understood that all relationships were potentially artificial and that individual identity was far more fragile and contingent than normal human experience suggested. The knowledge that entire civilizations could be destroyed through simple mistakes and selfish choices created in Morty a sense of responsibility and caution that would influence his decision-making throughout his subsequent adventures with Rick. But the lesson he drew from the love potion catastrophe was not that technological solutions to human problems were inherently dangerous, but rather that such solutions required more careful implementation and consideration of potential consequences. The tragedy was not that Morty learnt to avoid Rick's methods, but that he learnt to accept them as necessary evils that could be managed through improved planning and execution, rather than fundamental changes in approach or values. As Morty settled into his replacement identity and learned to navigate the complex emotional demands of living as someone else while maintaining relationships with people who loved a version of him that no longer existed, he laid the foundation for years of increasingly sophisticated moral compromise and psychological adaptation that would enable him to function as Rick's partner while gradually losing connection to the simple human values and emotional authenticity that had once defined his character and guided his choices in moments of crisis and uncertainty. The months that followed Morty's traumatic introduction to dimensional abandonment and identity replacement were characterized by a systematic education in cosmic horror that transformed him from sheltered suburban teenager into someone capable of navigating realities where the most fundamental assumptions about morality, physics, and the value of individual existence were routinely violated by beings whose power exceeded anything human civilization had ever imagined. The adventures that Rick presented as educational opportunities were actually exposure therapy conducted on a cosmic scale, designed to desensitize Morty to forms of violence and ethical complexity that would have broken most adult minds, while gradually building his tolerance for the kind of moral flexibility that interdimensional survival required. The pattern established itself with mechanical regularity during those early months of intensive multiversal travel, as Rick would select destinations based on their potential for providing Morty with specific types of traumatic education, while maintaining the pretense that their adventures were motivated by scientific curiosity or practical necessity, rather than deliberate psychological conditioning. Each portal jump carried them to realities where the comfortable illusions that sustained normal human existence were stripped away layer by layer, revealing underlying structures of power and predation that made Earth's worst atrocities seem like children's games by comparison. The first lesson in multiversal moral relativism came during their visit to a dimension where an advanced civilization had solved the problem of resource scarcity by systematically harvesting less developed species for biological materials, conducting their industrial genocide with the same casual efficiency that humans applied to livestock management. Rick's matter-of-fact explanation of the economic principles that made such practices inevitable in resource-constrained environments was delivered without moral judgment or emotional response, forcing Morty to confront the possibility that his instinctive horror at witnessing systematic slaughter might be nothing more than cultural conditioning that had no objective foundation in universal ethical principles. The beings who conducted this multiversal holocaust were not monsters driven by sadistic pleasure or ideological hatred, but rational actors, making calculated decisions about resource allocation and species survival that differed from human moral frameworks only in their scope and efficiency. Their casual friendliness toward Rick and Morty during their visit demonstrated that the capacity for kindness and genuine warmth could coexist with systematic cruelty toward beings who were categorized as resources rather than persons, creating cognitive dissonance that challenged every assumption Morty had developed about the relationship between individual character and moral behavior. Rick's comfortable familiarity with these genocidal civilizations and his apparent lack of moral conflict about conducting business with beings who casually eliminated entire species for profit provided Morty with education in the practical applications of nihilistic philosophy that went far beyond abstract intellectual exercise. The way Rick navigated complex negotiations with creatures whose hands were literally stained with the blood of billions while maintaining casual conversation about technical specifications and delivery schedules demonstrated a level of moral detachment that Morty found simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The psychological impact of witnessing Rick's comfortable participation in cosmic-scale atrocity was compounded by Morty's growing recognition that his grandfather's casual attitude toward multiversal genocide was not aberrant behavior, but rather the natural result of sufficient exposure to infinite realities, where every possible form of suffering and cruelty was being enacted simultaneously across countless dimensions. The education that Rick was providing was not just exposure to alien cultures, but systematic conditioning designed to prepare Morty for the kind of moral flexibility that multiversal citizenship required. But perhaps more disturbing than the alien atrocities they witnessed was Rick's gradual revelation that Earth's own history and contemporary civilization contained forms of systematic cruelty and exploitation that differed from multiversal genocide, primarily in their limited scale rather than their fundamental moral character. The factory farming that provided meat for suburban grocery stores, the economic systems that maintained artificial scarcity, while natural abundance remained technologically achievable, and the political structures that enabled systematic oppression of vulnerable populations were presented by Rick as evidence that humans had no moral authority to judge alien civilizations whose methods were more efficient but not fundamentally different. The relativity of moral judgment became a recurring theme in Rick's informal lectures during their interdimensional travels, as he used specific examples of alien behavior to illustrate broader principles about the arbitrary nature of ethical systems and the impossibility of establishing objective standards for evaluating behavior across cultures that had evolved under fundamentally different conditions. The intellectual sophistication of Rick's arguments was matched by their psychological toxicity, as they systematically undermined Morty's capacity for moral certainty while providing no alternative framework for making ethical decisions in complex situations. The adventure that took them to a reality where an advanced species had achieved immortality through systematic torture of beings whose suffering generated the energy necessary for life extension, provided Morty with direct confrontation with the question of whether any goal could justify unlimited means, while Rick's casual participation in their energy harvesting processes demonstrated his practical answer to philosophical questions that most beings never had to address outside of academic contexts. The way Rick discussed the technical specifications of torture-based energy generation with the same detached interest he might apply to any other engineering challenge revealed how completely his scientific training had severed his pained connection to normal emotional responses to suffering. The beings who had built their civilization around institutionalized torture were not sadistic monsters who took pleasure in causing pain, but rational actors who had made calculated decisions about acceptable costs for achieving desirable outcomes, and their genuine friendliness toward visitors who respected their cultural practices highlighted the disconnect between individual kindness and systematic cruelty that characterized most advanced civilizations in Rick Spice's experience. Their casual conversations about family relationships and personal interests while conducting their daily work of inflicting agony on sentient creatures provided Morty with education in the banality of evil that no amount of reading or theoretical discussion could have conveyed effectively. Rick's explanation of the economic principles that made torture-based energy generation more efficient than alternative power sources was delivered with the same analytical precision he brought to any technical problem, while his casual dismissal of Morty's moral objections as naive idealism revealed his fundamental inability to engage seriously with ethical concerns that conflicted with practical necessities or scientific curiosities. The way Rick evaluated the torture civilization's achievements in terms of their technological sophistication rather than their moral implications provided Morty with direct education in how superior intelligence could be used to rationalize behavior that violated every principle of decent human conduct. The psychological conditioning that Rick was conducting through these educational adventures was accomplished through systematic exposure to moral complexity that exceeded Morty's capacity for ethical reasoning, while providing no guidance or support for developing more sophisticated frameworks for making moral judgments in ambiguous situations. The boy who had once possessed clear, intuitive understanding of right and wrong was being systematically trained to suppress those instincts in favor of analytical approaches that treated ethical questions as technical problems with solutions that could be evaluated according to criteria of efficiency and effectiveness rather than moral worth. The cumulative effect of months spent witnessing cosmic-scale atrocities while receiving lectures about the relativity of moral judgment was to create in Morty a form of ethical paralysis that made him increasingly dependent on Rick's guidance for making decisions in complex situations where multiple values and interests conflicted. The confidence that Rick's scientific knowledge and multiversal experience provided was purchased at the cost of Morty's independent moral reasoning, creating psychological dependency that served Rick's need for a compliant adventure companion, while compromising Morty's development into an autonomous moral agent. The adventure that took them to 60 Minutes provided Morty with direct confrontation with the arbitrary nature of individual existence, and the possibility that his entire life history was nothing more than random chance that could have unfolded in countless different ways across alternate dimensions where versions of himself had made different choices or experienced different opportunities. The cable television show that displayed alternate versions of their family living completely different lives forced Morty to confront questions about personal identity and the significance of individual choices that his normal educational environment had never prepared him to address. The episode where alternate versions of his parents had remained together and produced different children who were more successful and better adjusted than Summer provided Morty with direct evidence that his sister's existence was contingent rather than inevitable, while Rick's casual explanation of dimensional replacement and identity substitution revealed that their current family structure was itself artificial and could be modified according to preference rather than accepted as natural or permanent. The recognition that family relationships he had always assumed to be fundamental constants were actually variables that could be manipulated through technological intervention created existential anxiety that no amount of reassurance could adequately address. Rick's matter-of-fact discussion of the practicalities involved in relocating to dimensions where their family had developed along more favorable trajectories was presented as analysis of available options rather than serious proposal, but the casual way he evaluated the relative merits of different versions of their family structure revealed his fundamental inability to understand why Morty might find such discussions psychologically disturbing rather than intellectually interesting. The scientific detachment that enabled Rick to analyze family relationships as systems that could be optimized through careful selection and modification was simultaneously impressive and horrifying in its implications for how he understood human connections and emotional bonds. The Roy simulation that Rick introduced as entertainment during one of their interdimensional adventures provided Morty with direct experience of living an entire human lifetime in accelerated time, complete with career development, marriage, family relationships, and the gradual decline of aging and death that gave meaning and urgency to every choice and relationship within the simulated reality. The psychological impact of experiencing 50 years of subjective time in what was objectively only a few minutes created temporal displacement that challenged Morty's understanding of personal continuity and the significance of individual moments within longer life narratives. The transition from Roy's death back to his normal teenage existence was marked by profound disorientation that went beyond simple confusion about current circumstances to encompass fundamental questions about which version of his experience was more real or meaningful. The decades he had lived as Roy, or the 14 years he had existed as Morty Smith. Rick's casual dismissal of the simulation as trivial entertainment that had no lasting significance revealed his inability to understand how the experience of alternate existence might affect someone who lacked his extensive experience with identity, replacement, and temporal manipulation. The philosophical implications of the Roy simulation extended beyond questions about the nature of reality to encompass fundamental concerns about the value and meaning of individual experience when such experiences could be artificially generated and terminated at will. The recognition that everything he had experienced as Roy, the love for his simulated family, the satisfaction of career achievement, the grief at losing people he cared about, could be dismissed as mere entertainment, raised disturbing questions about whether his own life as Morty possessed any greater claim to significance or permanence. Rick's explanation of simulation technology and its applications across multiversal civilizations revealed that artificial experience generation was commonplace among advanced species, while his casual mention of the therapeutic uses of simulated existence for treating trauma and psychological disorders suggested that reality itself was just one option among many for organizing consciousness and memory. The possibility that his own existence might be simulated rather than natural was presented by Rick as an interesting philosophical question rather than existential crisis, demonstrating once again his complete disconnection from normal human responses to challenges to fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The adventure that exposed Morty to the Meeseeks and their desperate desire for non-existence provided him with direct education in how the gift of life could become unbearable when existence was prolonged beyond its natural limits, or when beings were created for purposes that could not be fulfilled according to their essential nature. The way the Meeseeks begged for death while simultaneously working frantically to complete their assigned tasks revealed forms of suffering that exceeded anything Morty had previously imagined, while Rick's casual attitude toward creating beings whose existence was inherently torturous demonstrated his fundamental indifference to suffering that he could dismiss as temporary or necessary for achieving desired outcomes. Rick's explanation of Meeseeks' psychology and the technical principles that govern their creation and termination was delivered with the same analytical precision he brought to any scientific discussion, while his casual dismissal of their suffering as irrelevant to broader considerations about the usefulness of their services revealed how completely his multiversal perspective had severed his connection to normal empathy and moral reasoning. The way Rick evaluated the Meeseeks situation in terms of cost-benefit analysis, rather than ethical considerations about the morality of creating sentient beings destined for suffering, provided Morty with direct education in how scientific thinking could be used to justify behavior that violated basic principles of compassion and respect for conscious experience. The psychological impact of witnessing beings whose entire existence was structured around desperate desire for termination created in Morty a form of existential anxiety that went beyond normal adolescent concerns about meaning and purpose to encompass fundamental questions about whether consciousness itself was a gift or a burden, and whether existence was something to be celebrated or endured. The recognition that beings could be created specifically to suffer while serving the convenience of their creators revealed forms of cruelty that exceeded anything he had encountered in human society, while highlighting the potential for advanced technology to enable new forms of exploitation and abuse. The cumulative effect of these educational adventures was to transform Morty from someone who possessed clear, intuitive understanding of right and wrong into someone whose moral reasoning had been systematically compromised by exposure to ethical complexity that exceeded his capacity for independent judgment, while receiving guidance from someone whose own moral development had been corrupted by decades of multiversal violence and systematic abandonment of normal human values. The boy who had once been horrified by the love potion disaster was learning to accept cosmic-scale atrocity as natural and inevitable, while the empathy that had once defined his character was being gradually eroded by repeated exposure to suffering that was too vast and systematic to address through individual action or emotional response. Rick's educational methodology was simultaneously sophisticated and destructive, designed to prepare Morty for multiversal citizenship, while systematically undermining the psychological and moral foundations that might have enabled him to resist corruption or maintain connection to values that transcended practical considerations about survival and effectiveness. The knowledge that Rick was providing was genuine and valuable, but it was also toxic in ways that would compromise Morty's capacity for healthy relationships and autonomous moral reasoning throughout his subsequent development, creating dependencies that served Rick's psychological needs while potentially sacrificing Morty's long-term emotional and ethical development for short-term convenience and adventure. As Morty accumulated months of exposure to cosmic-scale horror and moral complexity, while receiving systematic conditioning designed to suppress his natural empathy and ethical intuitions, he was being prepared for years of increasingly sophisticated participation in Rick's adventures and schemes, but also for a lifetime of internal conflict between his residual human decency and the practical necessities of survival in realities where normal moral categories were inadequate for addressing the challenges that advanced beings routinely faced in their daily existence. The evolution of Morty Smith from traumatized victim of cosmic horror into someone capable of participating in and even orchestrating acts of violence that would have been unthinkable during his early adventures represented the most disturbing aspect of his psychological transformation under Rick's tutelage, as the empathy and moral sensitivity that had once defined his character were gradually eroded by repeated exposure to situations where survival required the abandonment of ethical principles that had no practical application in realities, governed by power rather than justice. The boy who had once been horrified by the accidental destruction of a single dimension was learning to accept systematic cruelty as an inevitable aspect of existence in a multiverse where superior beings routinely exploited weaker species for resources, entertainment, and the simple pleasure of exercising power over creatures too weak to resist their domination. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but rather a gradual process of moral desensitization that occurred through countless small compromises and rationalizations that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively represented the complete erosion of the ethical framework that had once guided Morty's responses to complex situations requiring moral judgment. Each adventure provided new evidence that the universe operated according to principles that made traditional human concepts of right and wrong not just impractical but actively dangerous for anyone who hoped to survive long enough to protect the people they cared about from the casual cruelty that characterized most advanced civilizations. The planet where they encountered systematic purging as a form of recreational activity provided Morty with his most intensive education in the psychology of institutionalized violence and the way that entire civilizations could organize themselves around the principle that inflicting suffering on others was not just acceptable but morally necessary for maintaining social cohesion and individual psychological health. The beings who participated in the annual purge were not monsters or psychopaths, but ordinary individuals who had been conditioned to believe that periodic expressions of violent impulses were essential for preventing more destructive forms of social conflict. Rick's enthusiastic participation in the purge activities revealed the extent to which his own psychological development had been shaped by similar conditioning processes, while his casual explanation of the purge's social benefits demonstrated his ability to rationalize systematic violence through appeals to utilitarian principles that prioritized collective stability over individual welfare. The way Rick discussed the purge as a sophisticated solution to problems of social organization and psychological management provided Morty with direct education in how intelligent beings could construct elaborate justifications for behavior that violated every principle of basic human decency. But perhaps more disturbing than Rick's intellectual analysis of the purge was his obvious enjoyment of the violence itself, as he demonstrated capabilities for inflicting pain and death that went far beyond what was necessary for their survival or mission completion, and seemed motivated more by psychological satisfaction than practical necessity. The casual efficiency with which Rick eliminated threats to their safety was accompanied by signs of genuine pleasure that revealed how completely his capacity for empathy had been replaced by predatory instincts that treated other conscious beings as objects to be manipulated or destroyed, according to his immediate needs and preferences. The psychological impact of witnessing Rick's enthusiastic participation in systematic violence was compounded by Morty's growing recognition that his own emotional responses to the carnage were becoming increasingly muted and analytical, rather than driven by the horror and revulsion that should have characterized any healthy person's reaction to witnessing torture and murder conducted for entertainment. The desensitization that was occurring in his own moral reasoning was not something he was consciously choosing, but rather an automatic psychological defense mechanism that protected him from emotional overwhelm while also compromising his capacity for the kind of moral reasoning that might have enabled him to resist Rick's influence. The moment when Morty first killed another sentient being in self-defense marked a crucial turning point in his psychological development, as the abstract possibility of violence became concrete reality that could never be undone or rationalized away through appeals to necessity or circumstance. The alien he killed was threatening their safety and had demonstrated clear hostile intent, but the ease with which Morty was able to end another being's existence revealed capabilities that he had not known he possessed, while also highlighting how completely his survival instincts had been developed through months of exposure to cosmic-scale danger. Rick's response to Morty's first kill was characteristically casual and focused on practical considerations about disposal of evidence and continuation of their mission, rather than acknowledgement of the psychological significance of crossing the moral boundary between someone who had never taken a life and someone who had demonstrated the capacity for lethal violence when circumstances required it. The way Rick dismissed Morty's emotional confusion and guilt as natural but temporary reactions that would fade with experience revealed his fundamental inability to understand the moral weight of ending another being's existence, or the psychological impact such actions might have on someone who retained connection to normal human empathy. The gradual accumulation of violent encounters during their subsequent adventures created a pattern where Morty's initial reluctance to use force was systematically worn down by repeated situations where violence represented the most efficient solution to immediate problems of survival and mission completion, while Rick's consistent modeling of casual brutality provided psychological conditioning that made extreme responses seem normal and appropriate, rather than evidence of moral failure or psychological dysfunction. The education Morty was receiving in practical violence was accompanied by systematic conditioning designed to suppress the emotional responses that might interfere with his ability to function effectively in dangerous situations. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Morty to participate in increasingly extreme violence without experiencing debilitating guilt or emotional breakdown were similar to those developed by professional soldiers and other individuals whose occupations required them to inflict harm on other human beings, but his conditioning was occurring without the institutional support structures and ethical frameworks that military organizations typically provided to help their personnel maintain psychological stability while performing morally complex duties. The isolation that accompanied his transformation into someone capable of casual violence was compounded by his inability to discuss his experiences with family members or peers who lacked the context necessary for understanding the practical necessities that had shaped his moral development. The adventure that took them to a reality where an advanced civilization had achieved social stability through systematic torture of designated victim classes provided Morty with direct education in how entire societies could be organized around principles of institutionalized cruelty while maintaining the appearance of ethical sophistication and cultural achievement. The beings who conducted their daily business while casually observing the torture of other sentient creatures were not sadistic monsters, but cultured individuals who had been conditioned to believe that the suffering of designated others was not just acceptable, but morally necessary for maintaining the welfare of their preferred social groups. Rick's comfortable integration into this torture-based civilization and his apparent lack of moral conflict about participating in their economic and social systems revealed how completely his multiversal perspective had severed his connection to the kind of universal moral principles that might have prevented him from collaborating with systematic oppression and exploitation. The way Rick discussed the technical specifications of torture equipment with the same detached interest he brought to any engineering challenge demonstrated his ability to compartmentalize moral considerations away from practical problem-solving in ways that enabled him to function effectively in any social context, regardless of its ethical implications. The philosophical discussions that Rick conducted with representatives of the torture civilization were characterized by sophisticated analysis of the utilitarian principles that supposedly justified their systematic cruelty, while his apparent acceptance of their arguments revealed his fundamental commitment to moral relativism that made any behavior potentially acceptable if it could be rationalized through appeals to cultural difference or practical necessity. The education Morty received through witnessing these conversations was instruction in how intellectual sophistication could be used to justify behavior that violated every principle of basic human decency while maintaining the appearance of rational, ethical reasoning. But perhaps most disturbing was Morty's gradual recognition that Rick's arguments about the relativity of moral judgment contained elements of logical consistency that made them difficult to refute through simple appeals to intuitive moral sense or emotional responses to suffering, while his own intellectual development was insufficient for constructing alternative philosophical frameworks that might provide foundation for maintaining ethical principles in the face of cosmic-scale complexity and moral ambiguity. The systematic erosion of his confidence in his own moral reasoning was accompanied by increasing dependency on Rick's guidance for making ethical decisions in situations where multiple values and interests conflicted in ways that exceeded his capacity for independent judgment. The cumulative effect of months spent participating in violence and witnessing systematic cruelty while receiving instruction in moral relativism was to create in Morty a form of ethical paralysis that made him capable of functioning in extreme situations while compromising his ability to maintain clear moral boundaries about behavior he was willing to accept or participate in, when survival or mission success required abandonment of principles that seemed arbitrary and culturally conditioned, rather than objectively valid. The confidence that Rick's philosophical sophistication provided was purchased at the cost of Morty's independent moral reasoning and his connection to the kind of ethical intuitions that might have enabled him to resist corruption or maintain values that transcended immediate, practical considerations. The adventure that exposed them to a civilization where advanced beings entertained themselves by creating and destroying entire universes populated with conscious creatures provided Morty with direct confrontation with the ultimate implications of power divorced from moral constraint, as he witnessed casual genocide conducted on scales that exceeded human comprehension while being treated as routine entertainment by beings whose technological capabilities made them effectively gods within their sphere of influence. The way these cosmic entities discussed the creation and termination of billions of lives with the same casual indifference that humans might apply to video game characters revealed forms of moral detachment that represented the logical endpoint of the philosophical trajectory that Rick was guiding Morty toward. Rick's fascination with the universe creation technology and his obvious admiration for beings who possessed such capabilities revealed his own aspirations toward the kind of godlike power that would enable him to reshape reality according to his preferences, while remaining unconstrained by moral considerations about the welfare of beings who lacked comparable abilities to resist or influence his decisions. The way Rick discussed the technical aspects of universe creation and destruction with representatives of this cosmic civilization provided Morty with education in how scientific curiosity could be completely divorced from ethical consideration for the conscious beings whose existence was being manipulated for experimental purposes. The psychological impact of witnessing casual omnicide conducted for entertainment was complicated by Morty's growing recognition that his own emotional responses to cosmic-scale atrocity were becoming increasingly analytical and complicated by Morty's, detached rather than characterized by the horror and moral outrage that should have defined any healthy person's reaction to witnessing systematic destruction of entire civilizations. The desensitization that was protecting him from emotional breakdown was also compromising his capacity for the kind of moral reasoning that might have enabled him to maintain ethical principles in the face of power relationships that made resistance seem both futile and irrational. The education that Rick was providing through these experiences was instruction in the practical implications of infinite power and the psychological adaptations necessary for functioning at cosmic scales where individual lives and entire civilizations became statistically negligible rather than morally significant. But the conditioning was occurring without corresponding development of wisdom or ethical frameworks that might have enabled Morty to maintain connection to values that transcended immediate considerations about power and survival. The knowledge he was gaining about the nature of reality and the capabilities of advanced beings was genuine and valuable, but it was also toxic in ways that would compromise his psychological and moral development throughout his subsequent life. The pattern that emerged from these educational adventures was systematic erosion of Morty's capacity for independent moral reasoning through exposure to ethical complexity that exceeded his ability to construct coherent responses while receiving guidance from someone whose own moral development had been corrupted by decades of multiversal violence and systematic abandonment of normal human values. The boy, who had once possessed clear, intuitive understanding of right and wrong, was being transformed into someone whose ethical reasoning was entirely dependent on frameworks provided by someone whose judgment had been compromised by power and isolation from the kind of human connections that might have maintained his connection to basic principles of compassion and respect for conscious experience. The most disturbing aspect of Morty's transformation was not his growing capacity for violence or his increasing tolerance for systematic cruelty, but rather his gradual loss of confidence in his own moral judgment and his increasing dependency on Rick's philosophical frameworks for making ethical decisions in complex situations where multiple values and interests conflicted in ways that seemed to require specialized knowledge and experience that only Rick possessed. The independence and autonomy that should have characterized healthy adolescent development were being systematically undermined by conditioning designed to create psychological dependency that served Rick's need for a compliant adventure companion while compromising Morty's capacity for the kind of independent moral reasoning that might have enabled him to resist corruption or maintain values that conflicted with immediate practical necessities. As Morty accumulated experience with cosmic-scale violence and systematic cruelty while receiving instruction in moral relativism and philosophical nihilism, He was being prepared for years of increasingly sophisticated participation in Rick's adventures and schemes, but also for a lifetime of internal conflict between his residual human decency and the practical necessities of survival, in realities where normal moral categories were inadequate for addressing the challenges that advanced beings routinely faced in their efforts to maintain power and achieve their objectives in a multiverse characterized by infinite competition and casual exploitation of weaker species by those with superior capabilities and fewer moral constraints. The discovery of evil Morty's existence represented the most psychologically devastating confrontation with his own potential that Morty Smith would experience during his formative years under Rick's influence, as the tortured screams, echoing from the abandoned warehouse on the citadel of Rick's, revealed not just evidence of systematic cruelty, but the horrifying recognition that someone with his own face and voice had evolved beyond normal human limitations to become a monster capable of inflicting suffering that exceeded anything Rick had ever conceived during his decades of multiversal violence. The boy who had spent months learning to suppress his empathy in order to survive cosmic-scale adventures was suddenly confronted with undeniable proof that his psychological trajectory toward moral flexibility and emotional detachment could ultimately lead to forms of evil that made Rick's casual brutality seem like restrained professionalism by comparison. The initial shock of seeing his own features reflected in the face of someone who could orchestrate systematic torture of alternate versions of Rick across multiple dimensions was compounded by Morty's growing recognition that evil, Morty's capabilities and strategic sophistication suggested intellectual development that no normal 14-year-old should have been able to achieve, regardless of the traumatic circumstances that might have shaped his evolution from innocent child into cosmic-scale predator. The evidence of advanced psychological manipulation and technological mastery that evil Morty displayed during their brief encounter revealed forms of adaptation to multiversal existence that represented possible futures for Morty's own development under continued exposure to Rick's influence and the corrupting effects of unlimited power. The torture chamber that evil Morty had constructed was not the product of sadistic impulses or psychological dysfunction, but rather the logical application of analytical thinking to the problem of extracting information and achieving compliance from beings whose intellectual capabilities and emotional responses could be systematically exploited through carefully calibrated applications of physical and psychological pressure. The clinical precision with which evil Morty had designed his interrogation facility demonstrated scientific thinking that had been completely divorced from moral consideration for the conscious beings whose suffering was being optimized according to purely technical criteria about efficiency and effectiveness. Rick's response to discovering evil Morty's operations was complicated by his obvious admiration for the sophistication and thoroughness of the torture techniques being employed, while his casual discussion of the technical specifications involved in systematic psychological breaking revealed how completely his own moral development had been compromised by years of treating conscious beings as objects to be manipulated according to his immediate needs and preferences. The way Rick evaluated evil Morty's work in terms of its innovative approaches to problem solving, rather than its ethical implications, provided Morty with direct education in how superior intelligence could be used to rationalize behavior that violated every principle of basic human decency. But perhaps more disturbing than Rick's intellectual appreciation for evil Morty's methods was his apparent lack of surprise or moral outrage at discovering that a version of Morty had evolved beyond normal human limitations to become something approaching a cosmic force of systematic cruelty. suggesting that Rick's extensive experience with multiversal civilization had provided him with sufficient examples of such transformations to make evil Morty's existence seem inevitable rather than aberrant. The casual way Rick discussed the psychological processes that might have produced evil Morty's development revealed his fundamental inability to recognize that his own influence on Morty's moral education might be creating conditions that could lead to similar outcomes. The philosophical questions that evil Morty's existence raised about the nature of identity and moral development across infinite dimensions were complicated by Morty's growing recognition that the differences between himself and his evil alternate might be less fundamental than the similarities they shared as beings who had been systematically exposed to cosmic-scale horror while receiving guidance from versions of Rick whose own moral development had been corrupted by power and isolation from normal human connections. The possibility that evil Morty represented not an aberrant outcome but rather the natural endpoint of sufficient exposure to Rick's influence created existential anxiety that no amount of rationalization could adequately address. The systematic nature of evil Morty's campaign against the Ricks suggested strategic thinking and long-term planning that exceeded what any individual should have been able to accomplish without access to resources and knowledge. That implied collaboration with other beings or institutions whose capabilities and motivations remained mysterious and potentially threatening to anyone who might attempt to interfere with their objectives. The scope and efficiency of evil Morty's operations revealed organizational capabilities that suggested he had evolved beyond the kind of isolated genius that characterized Rick's approach to multiversal dominance to become something approaching an institutional force capable of systematic warfare against entire civilizations. The recognition that evil Morty possessed detailed knowledge of Rick's psychology and operational methods, while also demonstrating capabilities that exceeded Rick's own achievements in areas of strategic planning and systematic manipulation, created implications for Morty's understanding of his own potential that went beyond simple concerns about moral development to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence and power when divorced from the kind of emotional connections that might constrain behavior according to principles that transcended immediate practical considerations about achieving desired outcomes through available means. Evil Morty's casual efficiency in manipulating the political structures of the Citadel while simultaneously conducting his torture operations revealed sophisticated understanding of institutional psychology and group dynamics that enabled him to function effectively within complex organizational frameworks while pursuing objectives that directly conflicted with the stated purposes and values of the institutions he was exploiting. The way evil Morty maintained his cover as a typical Morty while orchestrating systematic violence against the very beings who were supposed to be protecting him, demonstrated capabilities for deception and strategic thinking that no normal adolescent should have been able to develop regardless of their exposure to traumatic circumstances. The technological innovations that evil Morty had developed for controlling and manipulating other beings revealed scientific capabilities that exceeded Rick's own achievements, while also demonstrating approaches to problem-solving that prioritized efficiency and effectiveness over any consideration for the welfare or dignity of the conscious beings whose behavior was being modified according to his preferences. The devices that evil Morty used to control his puppet Rick and extract information from his torture victims represented applications of advanced neuroscience and psychology that treated consciousness itself as raw material to be shaped according to technical specifications rather than respected as intrinsically valuable. The psychological profile that emerged from observing evil Morty's behavior and capabilities suggested someone who had retained Rick-level intellectual capabilities while completely abandoning any vestige of the empathy and moral reasoning that might have constrained his behavior, according to principles that recognize the inherent worth and dignity of other conscious beings. The combination of superior intelligence with complete moral flexibility created possibilities for systematic cruelty and exploitation that exceeded anything that beings with normal human limitations could conceive or implement effectively. Rick's analysis of evil Morty's psychology and probable developmental history was delivered with the same analytical detachment he might apply to any scientific phenomenon, while his casual discussion of the environmental and experiential factors that could produce such extreme moral deviation revealed his fundamental inability to recognize that his own influence on Morty's development might be creating similar risk factors that could lead to comparable outcomes under sufficiently stressful or traumatic circumstances. The way Rick treated evil Morty's existence as an interesting case study rather than a warning about the potential consequences of his educational methodology demonstrated how completely his scientific training had severed his connection to normal protective instincts about child development and psychological welfare. The escape that freed them from evil Morty's immediate threat was accomplished through a combination of Rick's technological capabilities and strategic thinking, but the ease with which evil Morty had initially captured and controlled them revealed that the intellectual and technological advantages that Rick had assumed would always enable him to protect Morty from serious harm were not as reliable as he had believed. The recognition that beings with comparable or superior capabilities might pose threats that Rick could not anticipate or counter effectively created new sources of anxiety about the long-term safety and security of their Cade's interdimensional adventures. The aftermath of their encounter with evil Morty was characterized by uncomfortable questions about Morty's own developmental trajectory and the possibility that continued exposure to Rick's influence and the corrupting effects of multiversal power might ultimately produce psychological changes that could lead him down similar paths towards systematic cruelty and moral abandonment. The recognition that evil Morty had once been someone like himself created existential anxiety about the stability of his own moral identity and the reliability of the ethical principles that he had assumed would always prevent him from becoming the kind of monster who could torture other conscious beings for strategic advantage. Rick's attempts to reassure Morty about the fundamental differences between his own psychology and evil Morty's moral deviation were undermined by his inability to provide convincing explanations for why those differences should be expected to remain stable under continued exposure to the kind of traumatic experiences and moral complexity that characterized their interdimensional adventures. The casual way Rick dismissed concerns about evil Morty's potential influence, or the broader implications of his existence, revealed his fundamental inability to engage seriously with questions about the psychological and moral risks that their lifestyle posed for Morty's long-term development and emotional welfare. The philosophical discussions that followed their encounter with evil Morty were characterized by Rick's systematic attempts to minimize the significance of what they had witnessed while providing intellectual frameworks that would enable Morty to continue participating in their adventures without being paralyzed by anxiety about his own potential for moral corruption. The arguments that Rick constructed about the fundamental differences between necessary survival adaptations and genuine evil were sophisticated but ultimately unconvincing attempts to maintain psychological distance from uncomfortable recognition that the capabilities and moral flexibility that made Morty useful as an adventure companion might also make him vulnerable to the kind of systematic corruption that had produced evil Morty. The long-term psychological impact of encountering evil Morty was to create in Morty a persistent form of self-doubt and moral anxiety that would influence his responses to ethical challenges throughout his subsequent adventures, as he found himself constantly monitoring his own reactions and motivations for signs that he might be developing in directions that could ultimately lead to the kind of systematic cruelty and emotional detachment that characterized evil. Morty's approach to problem-solving. The recognition that moral corruption could occur gradually through small compromises and rationalizations, rather than dramatic choices, made it increasingly difficult for Morty to maintain confidence in his own ethical reasoning and resistance to the corrupting influences that surrounded him. The knowledge that infinite versions of himself existed across multiple dimensions, some of whom had evolved into monsters capable of systematic torture and murder, created existential anxiety about the nature of identity and moral development that transcended normal adolescent concerns about personal growth and character formation. The possibility that his own moral principles and emotional responses might be less stable and reliable than he had assumed forced Morty to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between individual psychology and environmental influences that his normal educational background had never prepared him to address adequately. The strategic implications of evil Morty's existence extended beyond immediate concerns about personal safety to encompass broader questions about the stability and security of the multiversal civilization that Rick had introduced. Morty 2. While the recognition that beings with comparable or superior capabilities might be conducting similar operations across infinite dimensions created new sources of anxiety about threats that could not be anticipated or countered through conventional defensive measures. The universe that had seemed dangerous but ultimately manageable under Rick's protection now appeared to contain forms of systematic evil that exceeded anything they had previously encountered or imagined. As Morty struggled to integrate the psychological and philosophical implications of encountering evil Morty into his understanding of himself and his relationship with Rick, he was forced to confront fundamental questions about the nature of moral development and the reliability of ethical principles when subjected to the kind of extreme pressures and traumatic experiences that characterized multiversal existence. The boy who had once possessed clear intuitive understanding of right and wrong now found himself constantly questioning whether his moral reasoning was adequate for addressing the complex challenges that advanced beings routinely faced in their efforts to survive and achieve their objectives in realities governed by power rather than justice. The encounter with evil Morty marked a crucial turning point in Morty's psychological development, as he was forced to acknowledge that the corrupting influences he had been exposed to through his relationship with Rick represented genuine risks to his moral integrity and long-term psychological welfare, rather than simply challenging experiences that would ultimately contribute to his personal growth and character development. The recognition that he could become a monster created new forms of self-awareness and moral vigilance that would influence his choices and responses throughout his subsequent adventures, but also created psychological burdens that no adolescent should have been expected to carry without extensive support and guidance from adults who possessed the wisdom and emotional stability necessary for helping him navigate such complex moral territory. The complex web of relationships that bound the Smith family together despite their fundamental dysfunction and Rick's systematic manipulation of their emotional dynamics provided Morty with his most intensive education in the most intensive practical applications of love, as both a source of strength and a vulnerability that could be exploited by those who understood how to weaponize genuine care and concern for personal advantage. The bonds that connected him to his parents and sister transcended the rational analysis that Rick applied to all human connections, creating emotional anchors that remained meaningful even as Morty's understanding of identity and reality was systematically undermined by exposure to infinite alternate versions of everyone he cared about across dimensions where their relationships had developed along completely different trajectories. Summer's evolution from typical teenage sister, focused on social status and peer approval, into someone capable of understanding and participating in the cosmic scale adventures that had become the central organizing principle of Cryer. Morty's existence represented one of the few genuinely positive developments in the Smith family's adaptation to Rick's presence in their lives. The natural intelligence and emotional resilience that Summer had always possessed but rarely displayed in academic or family contexts became increasingly evident as she demonstrated her ability to process interdimensional travel and alien encounters with the same analytical sophistication that Morty had developed through months of intensive exposure to multiversal complexity. The sibling bond that developed between Morty and Summer during their shared adventures was strengthened by their mutual recognition that they were both struggling to maintain psychological stability and moral clarity while being exposed to experiences that exceeded anything their normal, educational and social environments had prepared them to handle effectively. The conspiracy of silence that they maintained about the true nature of their family's adventures created intimacy based on shared secrets and mutual protection that transcended the typical antagonisms and competitions that characterized most adolescent sibling relationships. Summer's questions about the psychological and moral implications of their interdimensional activities revealed her natural capacity for ethical reasoning and critical thinking that had been overshadowed by her previous focus on social conformity and peer acceptance, but which became increasingly important as she recognized that the adventures Rick provided came with costs and consequences that affected not just their immediate family, but countless beings across infinite realities who were impacted by Rick's casual approach to problem solving through technological intervention and dimensional manipulation. The protective instincts that Morty developed towards Summer during their shared exposure to cosmic-scale dangers represented his first successful application of the survival skills and moral flexibility that Rick's education had provided as he learned to navigate complex situations where protecting his sister required him to make rapid decisions about acceptable risks and necessary compromises that balanced immediate safety concerns against longer-term considerations about psychological welfare and moral development. The responsibility that Morty felt for Summer's well-being during their adventures provided him with motivation for developing competence and confidence that transcended his own self-preservation instincts. But perhaps more importantly, Summer's presence during their interdimensional travels served as a constant reminder of the human values and emotional connections that Rick's nihilistic worldview dismissed as arbitrary and meaningless, forcing Morty to articulate and defend principles about family loyalty and mutual care that he might otherwise have abandoned. Under the pressure of Rick's systematic conditioning, designed to eliminate emotional attachments that could interfere with optimal decision-making in extreme circumstances, the need to explain and justify his protective behavior towards Summer required Morty to develop more sophisticated understanding of his own moral reasoning and the philosophical foundations that supported his resistance to complete moral relativism. The evolution of Morty's relationship with his parents was complicated by his growing awareness of their fundamental limitations and psychological dysfunction, while also developing deeper appreciation for the genuine love and concern they expressed despite their inability to provide the kind of guidance and support that his extraordinary circumstances required. The recognition that Beth and Jerry were struggling with their own emotional and practical challenges while attempting to maintain family stability in the face of Rick's disruptive influence created empathy that transcended Morty's adolescent frustrations with their apparent incompetence and irrelevance to his increasingly complex inner life. Beth's attempts to understand and connect with her son, despite her obvious inability to comprehend the true nature of his experiences with Rick, represented forms of maternal love that persisted despite the growing gulf between Morty's psychological reality and the normal concerns about academic performance and social adjustment that Beth felt equipped to address through conventional parenting approaches. The conversations they shared about school activities and peer relationships became increasingly artificial and strained as Morty struggled to maintain interest in topics that seemed trivial compared to the cosmic-scale challenges he faced during his interdimensional adventures. The patience that Morty learned to display toward his mother's attempts at guidance and support required him to develop emotional regulation skills that enabled him to suppress his natural frustration with her inability to understand the complexity of his actual situation while maintaining appreciation for the genuine care and concern that motivated her efforts to provide nurturing and direction. The exercise of protecting Beth from knowledge that would have been psychologically devastating while also accepting her love and guidance in areas where her experience remained relevant represented sophisticated relationship management that exceeded what most adults achieved in their interactions with family members. Jerry's role in Morty's psychological development was complicated by his obvious inadequacy as a father figure and role model, while also representing forms of ordinary human decency and emotional authenticity that provided important contrast to Rick's sophisticated manipulation and moral flexibility. The genuine affection that Jerry expressed for his son despite his inability to offer useful guidance or protection created emotional bonds that remained meaningful even as Morty's respect for his father's competence and judgment decreased. Through comparison with Rick's superior capabilities and cosmic perspective, the defense of Jerry that Morty sometimes found himself providing during family conflicts required him to articulate values about loyalty and compassion that transcended rational evaluation of individual merit or practical usefulness, forcing him to develop more sophisticated understanding of the principles that governed healthy family relationships, despite their apparent inefficiency compared to the strategic approaches that Rick applied to all human connections. The recognition that Jerry deserved protection and respect, despite his obvious limitations, represented moral reasoning that resisted the utilitarian calculations that characterized Rick's approach to evaluating the worth and significance of individual people. The most challenging aspect of maintaining family relationships while participating in Rick's adventures was managing the constant tension between his desire to protect his loved ones from knowledge that would be psychologically damaging and his need for authentic connection with people who understood and supported his actual experiences, rather than the carefully edited version of his life that he presented to maintain their emotional stability. The loneliness that resulted from keeping cosmic-scale secrets from the people who cared about him most created forms of isolation that no amount of adventure or intellectual stimulation could adequately address. The family dinners and routine domestic interactions that continued, despite the extraordinary nature of Morty's actual experiences, provided him with anchoring in normal human concerns and relationships that served as psychological ballast against the nihilistic implications of Rick's worldview and the existential anxiety that accompanied constant exposure to infinite realities where nothing seemed permanent or ultimately meaningful. The simple pleasure of sharing meals and conversation with people who loved him regardless of his achievements or failures represented forms of unconditional acceptance that contrasted sharply with the performance-based relationships that characterized most of his interactions in interdimensional contexts. The moments when Morty chose family welfare over Rick's objectives represented crucial exercises in moral reasoning and priority setting that enabled him to maintain connection to values that transcended immediate, practical considerations about adventure, success, or personal safety, while also demonstrating his growing capacity for independent judgment about situations where loyalty to different people in his life created conflicting obligations that could not be resolved through simple appeals to hierarchy or authority. The courage required to oppose Rick when family members were at risk revealed moral development that exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to balance competing loyalties and responsibilities. The protection that Morty learned to provide for his family members during crises created by Rick's activities required him to develop strategic thinking and leadership capabilities that enabled him to coordinate collective responses to threats while managing the psychological and emotional needs of people who lacked his experience with extreme circumstances and interdimensional survival techniques. The responsibility that Morty accepted for family welfare during emergencies represented maturation that occurred years ahead of normal developmental schedules, but also created burdens that no adolescent should have been expected to carry without extensive support and guidance. The recognition that his family members possessed their own forms of intelligence and emotional strength that complemented rather than competed with the capabilities that Rick's education had provided helped Morty develop more balanced and realistic assessment of human potential and the different types of knowledge and skills that contributed to successful navigation of complex life challenges. The appreciation that he learned to express for ordinary human virtues like kindness, patience, and loyalty provided important counterbalance to Rick's emphasis on intellectual superiority and technological capability as the primary measures of individual worth and significance. The family traditions and rituals that continued despite the disruption that Rick's presence created in their domestic routines served as reminders of continuity and shared history that transcended the immediate chaos and uncertainty that characterized their day-to-day existence, while also providing opportunities for experiencing forms of happiness and contentment that were independent of the intellectual stimulation and cosmic significance that Rick's adventures offered. The simple pleasure of celebrating birthdays and holidays with people who remembered his childhood and cared about his future provided Morty with emotional resources that supported his psychological stability during periods of particular stress or moral confusion. The conversations that Morty began having with family members about philosophical and ethical questions raised by his experiences with Rick represented his attempts to maintain intellectual honesty about his actual concerns and interests, while also sharing the burden of moral reasoning with people whose different perspectives and life experiences could provide valuable insights that his specialized education in interdimensional survival and cosmic awareness could not supply. The wisdom that ordinary family relationships could provide about human nature and emotional needs remained relevant and important, despite Rick's dismissive attitude toward normal human concerns and conventional approaches to problem-solving. The loyalty that Morty maintained toward his family, despite their obvious limitations, and his growing awareness of their psychological dysfunction, represented moral reasoning that prioritized love and connection over rational evaluation of Dharma, individual merit, or practical usefulness, while also demonstrating his resistance to the purely strategic approaches to relationship management that Rick modeled through his systematic manipulation of family dynamics according to his preferences and objectives. The commitment that Morty expressed to protecting and supporting family members, regardless of their ability to reciprocate or contribute equally to their collective welfare, revealed moral development that transcended the transactional frameworks that govern most relationships in the interdimensional contexts where Rick conducted his activities. The balance that Morty learned to maintain between his cosmic education and his family responsibilities required him to develop sophisticated emotional regulation and relationship management skills that enabled him to function effectively in multiple contexts with dramatically different demands and expectations, while also maintaining psychological integration and moral consistency that prevented the compartmentalization and identity fragmentation that might otherwise have resulted from exposure to such fundamentally incompatible worldviews, value systems. As Morty continued to develop his capacity for maintaining authentic relationships with family members while also participating in Rick's adventures and educational projects, he demonstrated forms of emotional intelligence and moral reasoning that exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to balance competing loyalties and responsibilities, while also creating foundation for psychological stability and ethical development that would enable him to resist the complete moral corruption that had characterized Evil Morty's response to similar educational experiences and family circumstances. The recognition that family love could coexist with honest acknowledgement of individual limitations and dysfunction represented sophisticated relationship skills that would serve Morty throughout his subsequent development, while also providing him with emotional anchoring and moral guidance that complemented rather than competed with the intellectual and technological capabilities that Rick's education was developing. The wisdom that ordinary family relationships provided about human nature and the conditions necessary for psychological welfare remained relevant and important, regardless of the cosmic scope and technological sophistication of the challenges that Morty would face during his continued adventures across infinite realities where power and knowledge offered no guarantee of happiness or fulfillment without the emotional connections that made existence meaningful rather than simply endurable. The transformation of Morty Smith from passive victim of Rick's manipulation into someone capable of active resistance and independent moral judgment represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of his psychological development, as the months of exposure to cosmic-scale horror and systematic conditioning designed to suppress his empathy and ethical reasoning gradually produced not the compliant adventure companion that Rick had intended to create, but rather a young man whose moral intelligence had been strengthened, rather than weakened by constant confrontation with ethical complexity that exceeded normal human experience. The boy who had once accepted Rick's authority without question was learning to recognize when that authority was being exercised in ways that violated principles more fundamental than loyalty or gratitude, while also developing the courage and strategic thinking necessary for effective opposition to someone whose intellectual and technological capabilities far exceeded his own. The first meaningful act of rebellion occurred not during a moment of dramatic crisis or philosophical revelation, but rather through Morty's quiet refusal to participate in what seemed like a routine adventure that would have required him to assist in activities that he recognized as fundamentally wrong, regardless of their strategic necessity, or Rick's casual dismissal of moral objections as naive idealism. The simple act of saying no to someone who had never previously encountered resistance to his authority represented a crucial assertion of independent moral judgment that established Morty's psychological autonomy even when he lacked the practical power to enforce his ethical boundaries through direct confrontation or physical resistance. Rick's response to Morty's first serious act of defiance revealed the extent to which his entire approach to family relationships and adventure planning had been built on assumptions about his grandson's continued compliance and emotional dependency, while his obvious surprise and frustration at encountering resistance demonstrated how completely he had failed to anticipate that his educational methodology might produce moral development rather than the systematic corruption that had characterized his own response to multiversal exposure. The anger that Rick displayed when his authority was challenged for the first time contained elements of genuine confusion about how someone he had been systematically conditioning for months could have developed sufficient independence to oppose him on ethical grounds. But beneath Rick's immediate frustration with Morty's rebellion lay deeper recognition that his grandson's moral development represented both threat to his control over family dynamics and potential vindication of his faith, that Morty possessed something worth protecting from the corrupting influences that had transformed Rick himself into someone capable of casual violence and systematic manipulation of people he claimed to love. The internal conflict between Rick's need for compliant partnership and his residual capacity for recognizing moral courage when it appeared in someone he cared about created psychological tension that would influence their relationship throughout Morty's subsequent development toward genuine autonomy and ethical sophistication. The strategic methods that Morty developed for opposing Rick's more morally questionable projects required him to understand his grandfather's psychology and motivational patterns with sufficient sophistication to predict and counter Rick's attempts at manipulation, while also identifying opportunities for influencing Rick's decisions through appeals to values and interests that transcended immediate practical considerations about efficiency and effectiveness. The psychological chess game that developed between them represented Morty's practical education in applied ethics and strategic thinking that exceeded anything his normal academic environment could have provided. The moment when Morty first chose to protect innocent beings from Rick's casual cruelty, despite the personal risks involved in opposing someone whose technological capabilities made him effectively invulnerable to conventional forms of resistance, marked a crucial transition from moral reasoning to moral action that demonstrated his capacity for heroism that transcended self-preservation instincts and family loyalty. The courage that such actions required was not the simple bravery of someone facing physical danger, but rather the complex moral courage necessary for maintaining ethical principles when doing so threatened relationships and security that had become central to his psychological stability and practical welfare. The aliens whose lives Morty saved through his intervention in Rick's casual violence were not individuals with whom he had any personal connection or shared cultural understanding, but rather beings whose suffering he recognized as morally significant regardless of their species, appearance, or ability to reciprocate his concern for their welfare. The universalization of moral consideration that such actions represented demonstrated ethical development that had somehow survived and even been strengthened by months of systematic conditioning designed to eliminate empathy and replace it with the kind of strategic thinking that treated all beings as resources to be managed according to immediate needs and preferences. Rick's grudging respect for Morty's moral stance was complicated by his fundamental inability to understand how someone could prioritize abstract ethical principles over practical considerations about mission success and personal safety, while his occasional acquiescence to Morty's demands for more humane approaches to problem-solving revealed the continuing influence of emotional bonds that he had assumed were purely instrumental rather than genuinely meaningful. The recognition that Morty's resistance to his authority was motivated by moral reasoning rather than simple rebelliousness created cognitive dissonance that challenged Rick's understanding of human psychology and the conditions under which ethical behavior could persist despite systematic pressure toward moral compromise. The adventures where Morty's compassion and ethical reasoning provided solutions that Rick's cynicism and technological superiority could not achieve demonstrated the practical value of moral intelligence in situations where understanding human psychology and motivation was more important than manipulating physical reality or overwhelming opposition through superior firepower. The times when Morty's approach to complex problems produced better outcomes than Rick's methods provided vindication for maintaining ethical principles, even in contexts where such principles seemed impractical or potentially dangerous. The development of Morty's capacity for independent moral judgment was accompanied by growing confidence in his own intellectual capabilities and strategic thinking that enabled him to engage with Rick as something approaching an MBNT, equal rather than simply a student or subordinate whose primary value lay in his utility as adventure, companion, and emotional anchor. The respect that Rick began showing for Morty's insights and contributions represented acknowledgement that their relationship had evolved beyond the simple hierarchy of teacher and student towards something more complex that required negotiation and compromise, rather than unilateral decision-making based on assumed intellectual superiority. The philosophical discussions that began occurring between Rick and Morty during their adventures reflected Morty's growing sophistication in ethical reasoning and his capacity for articulating moral positions that could withstand Rick's attempts at intellectual demolition through appeals to cosmic perspective and practical necessity. The ability that Morty developed for defending human values and emotional connections against Rick's nihilistic worldview required him to construct philosophical frameworks that were sufficiently sophisticated to address questions about meaning and morality in contexts where traditional approaches to ethics seemed inadequate or naive. But perhaps most importantly, Morty's rebellion against Rick's authority was characterized not by rejection of their relationship or abandonment of loyalty and affection, but rather by insistence that genuine care and concern required honest engagement with moral questions rather than simple compliance with directives that violated principles more fundamental than family harmony or personal convenience. The maturity that such an approach required exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to maintain relationships with people whose behavior they found morally objectionable while continuing to care about their welfare and development. The balance that Morty learned to maintain between resistance to Rick's more questionable activities and continued participation in adventures that provided intellectual excitement and cosmic significance required sophisticated emotional regulation and relationship management skills that enabled him to oppose specific decisions without rejecting their entire connection or abandoning his grandfather to the isolation and moral corruption that had characterized Rick's existence before their relationship began. The loyalty that Morty expressed through his willingness to challenge Rick's behavior rather than simply accepting it represented forms of love that transcended mere emotional attachment to encompass genuine concern for Rick's moral development and psychological welfare. The times when Morty's intervention prevented Rick from taking actions that would have increased his isolation from human values and emotional connections demonstrated the practical benefits of maintaining ethical principles even in relationships with people whose behavior seemed to justify abandonment or rejection according to conventional moral frameworks. The patience and persistence that such interventions required reflected Morty's growing understanding that meaningful change in complex relationships occurred through sustained engagement rather than dramatic confrontations or ultimatums that forced binary choices between competing loyalties. The recognition that Rick's resistance to moral authority was itself motivated by trauma and defensive strategies designed to protect him from further emotional damage enabled Morty to approach their conflicts with compassion and mation, strategic thinking that addressed underlying psychological needs, rather than simply opposing surface behaviors that violated his ethical principles. The therapeutic dimension that began characterizing Morty's approach to managing their relationship required him to develop understanding of human psychology and emotional healing that complemented his growing moral sophistication. The evolution of their adventures to include more collaborative decision-making and shared responsibility for outcomes represented progress toward genuine partnership that respected both Rick's superior knowledge and experience and Morty's moral intelligence and emotional grounding in human values that had somehow survived systematic exposure to cosmic-scale complexity and violence. The mutual respect that began characterizing their interactions provided foundation for continued relationship development that could accommodate Morty's growing independence while maintaining the emotional connections that made their adventures meaningful rather than simply exciting. The other family members who witnessed Morty's growing confidence and moral authority during family crises created by Rick's activities began to recognize him as someone whose judgment could be trusted in situations where Rick's superior capabilities were accompanied by questionable motivations or insufficient consideration for consequences that affected people outside their immediate circle. The leadership role that Morty gradually assumed during family emergencies represented recognition of his unique position as someone who understood both Rick's capabilities and limitations, while maintaining connection to values that prioritized collective welfare over individual interests or scientific curiosity. The heroic moments when Morty chose family welfare over personal safety, or Rick's objectives demonstrated moral courage that exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to balance competing loyalties and responsibilities, while also providing evidence that his exposure to cosmic-scale challenges had strengthened rather than corrupted his capacity for making ethical decisions under pressure. The consistency with which Morty prioritized protection of innocent beings over practical considerations about efficiency or personal convenience revealed moral development that had somehow transcended the conditioning he had received and produced genuine wisdom about human values and their practical applications. As Morty continued to develop his capacity for independent moral judgment and effective resistance to authority that violated his ethical principles, he established foundation for psychological autonomy and moral integrity that would enable him to maintain his essential humanity, despite continued exposure to the corrupting influences that characterized multiversal civilization and the practical necessities of survival in realities where power often took precedence over justice or compassion in determining outcomes and relationships. The revelation that Rick had systematically constructed the central finite curve as a cosmic-scale prison designed to ensure his intellectual superiority across infinite realities represented the most devastating challenge to Morty's understanding of morality and justice that he had encountered during his years of interdimensional education. As the boy who had learned to accept individual acts of cruelty and systematic exploitation as unfortunate but inevitable aspects of multiversal existence, was suddenly confronted with evidence that his beloved grandfather had committed crimes against consciousness itself that exceeded in scope and duration anything that the most genocidal civilizations had achieved through conventional warfare and territorial expansion. The mathematical elegance of the dimensional barrier that confined countless billions of beings to realities where Rick would always be the smartest person in the universe was simultaneously a monument to intellectual achievement and a testament to the kind of cosmic-scale narcissism that could transform even justified grief into systematic oppression of innocent populations who had never threatened Rick or chosen to participate in his psychological experiments in guaranteed superiority. The technical sophistication required to survey infinite dimensions and categorize them according to criteria that placed Rick's intellectual capabilities at the center of universal significance revealed forms of scientific achievement that should have been celebrated as evidence of human potential transcending normal limitations. But the purpose for which such capabilities had been employed demonstrated how completely Rick's genius had been corrupted by psychological needs that made his own emotional stability more important than the freedom and autonomy of everyone else who existed within his carefully curated version of reality. The prison that Rick had constructed around himself and everyone he claimed to care about was invisible to its inmates, but represented the most comprehensive system of control and manipulation that any being had ever successfully implemented across multiple dimensions. Morty's initial response to learning about the central finite curve was complicated by his instinctive desire to defend Rick against accusations that seemed to exceed even his grandfather's capacity for casual cruelty. But the mathematical evidence that evil Morty presented was undeniable and comprehensive enough to eliminate any possibility that the dimensional barrier was accidental or had been created for benevolent purposes that might justify its vanities. Systematic violation of consent and autonomy. The recognition that every adventure they had shared, every lesson Rick had taught him about survival and moral flexibility, and every relationship he had formed within the curve had occurred within a reality that existed only because Rick had decided it should continue to exist, represented a fundamental challenge to Morty's understanding of free will and personal agency. The philosophical implications of discovering that his entire existence had been predetermined by Rick's psychological need to remain the most important person in any reality he might choose to inhabit created forms of existential anxiety that exceeded anything Morty had experienced during his previous encounters with cosmic-scale horror and moral complexity. As the boy who had learned to find meaning and purpose through his relationships and moral choices was forced to confront the possibility that such meaning was artificial and contingent rather than genuine and autonomous. The love he felt for his family and the moral principles he had developed through his resistance to Rick's influence were real experiences, but they had occurred within a context that had been designed to ensure certain outcomes, while eliminating others that might have challenged Rick's assumptions about his own significance. The systematic nature of the oppression that the central finite curve enabled was not limited to preventing Rick from encountering beings smarter than himself, but extended to creating conditions where billions of Mortys across infinite dimensions were condemned to lives of trauma and exploitation, specifically to serve Rick's emotional needs and provide him with adventure companions whose psychological profiles made them useful for managing his anxiety about isolation and meaninglessness. The recognition that his own suffering and moral education had been orchestrated not by random chance or natural development, but by deliberate design, intended to produce a specific type of person who would serve Rick's psychological requirements, represented the ultimate revelation of how completely he had been instrumentalized despite Rick's apparent affection and care. Evil Morty's explanation of the data structures and decision trees that governed reality selection within the central finite curve revealed the extent to which Rick's construction of their prison had been motivated not by simple desire for intellectual validation, but by systematic need to eliminate any possibility that he might encounter evidence of his own moral failures or limitations through comparison with versions of himself who had made different choices about how to respond to trauma and power. The dimensional barrier was designed to protect Rick, not just from being smarter than himself, but from versions of himself who had retained greater connection to human values and achieved happier outcomes through methods that prioritized love and connection over control and manipulation. The torture chamber that evil Morty had constructed was presented not as evidence of his own capacity for cruelty, but rather as artistic representation of the psychological torture that the central finite curve inflicted on everyone trapped within its boundaries, while his systematic elimination of Ricks was characterized as mercy killing designed to end their participation in a system of oppression that made them complicit in cosmic scale violations of consent and autonomy, regardless of their individual awareness of the true nature of their situation. The moral complexity of evil Morty's response to discovering the curve created challenges for Morty's ethical reasoning that exceeded anything he had previously encountered in his efforts to maintain clear principles about right and wrong. Rick's defensive responses to evil Morty's accusations focused on technical justifications for the central finite curve's existence that emphasized its role in protecting reality from chaos and providing stability for interdimensional civilization. But his arguments were transparently self-serving and failed to address the fundamental violation of consent that the barrier represented, or the systematic suffering it enabled through its elimination of alternatives that might have provided better outcomes for the beings trapped within its boundaries. The intellectual sophistication that Rick brought to rationalizing his cosmic-scale crime revealed how completely his analytical capabilities had been compromised by psychological needs that made honest self-reflection impossible. But perhaps most disturbing was Rick's apparent inability to understand why Morty might find the revelation of the central finite curve morally devastating rather than simply intellectually interesting, as his casual discussion of the practical benefits of controlled reality suggested that he had lost all connection to the kind of emotional and ethical responses that might have enabled him to recognize the horror of what he had accomplished through his technological mastery of interdimensional physics. The same detachment that enabled Rick to function effectively in extreme circumstances had also made him incapable of engaging seriously with moral criticism that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and authority. The countdown to the central finite curve's destruction was accompanied by systematic revelation of additional secrets that Rick had maintained about the true nature of their adventures and relationships. As evil Morty used his stolen knowledge of Rick's psychology to maximum advantage in demonstrating how completely Morty's understanding of his own life and choices had been compromised by systematic deception and manipulation that exceeded simple lies, to encompass the complete fabrication of experiential contexts that made certain forms of psychological development inevitable, while eliminating others. The brain scan footage that showed Rick's casual disposal of Morty corpses across multiple dimensions was presented not just as evidence of callousness, but as proof that even Rick's most important relationships were ultimately expendable when they conflicted with his broader objectives or personal convenience. Morty's psychological response to learning the full scope of Rick's deception and the systematic nature of his own manipulation was complicated by years of emotional investment in their relationship and growing recognition that his own moral development had been shaped by exposure to Rick's nihilistic worldview in ways that made him complicit in the oppression of countless other beings who deserved the same consideration and protection that Rick provided only to those who served his immediate psychological needs. The guilt that accompanied this recognition was not simple regret about specific choices, but rather existential horror at discovering that his entire identity had been constructed within a prison designed to ensure certain outcomes while eliminating others. The philosophical questions that evil Morty raised about the nature of identity and meaning within the central finite curve resonated with Morty's growing understanding of his own situation as someone whose significance in Rick's life was based not on unique personal qualities but on his utility as an emotional anchor and adventure companion who could be replaced when necessary with alternate versions who possessed similar psychological profiles and relationship dynamics. The recognition that countless other Mortys had served similar functions for their respective Ricks across infinite dimensions undermined any sense that his relationship with Rick was special or irreplaceable in ways that transcended purely practical considerations about psychological management and adventure logistics. The destruction of the Citadel and the systematic elimination of Rick-dominated civilization that accompanied the central finite curve's collapse represented not just the end of an oppressive system, but also the elimination of the only form of social organization that Rick had ever successfully created or participated in. While evil Morty's escape into the broader multiverse symbolized the possibility of existence beyond the psychological and philosophical frameworks that had defined Morty's entire understanding of reality and relationships, the chaos and violence that marked the curve's destruction provided direct education in the costs of systematic oppression and the inevitable consequences of building civilizations around the principle that some beings deserved consideration while others existed only to serve their needs and preferences. Rick's desperate attempts to maintain control over the situation while protecting Morty from the immediate consequences of the Citadel's destruction revealed the genuine care and concern that coexisted with his systematic manipulation and exploitation, but also highlighted the fundamental contradiction between love and control that had characterized their relationship from its beginning and made it impossible for Rick to provide the kind of protection and guidance that genuine care would have required. The recognition that Rick's affection was real but was also inseparable from his need to maintain psychological control created cognitive dissonance that no amount of rationalization could resolve satisfactorily. The escape from the collapsing Citadel provided Morty with direct experience of the chaos and destruction that resulted from challenging fundamental structures of power and control, but also forced him to confront questions about his own complicity in systems of oppression that he had benefited from while remaining largely ignorant of their true costs and consequences. The destruction of Rick's portal fluid supplies eliminated their ability to easily travel between dimensions, while also symbolically severing their connection to the technological superiority that had enabled Rick's godlike control over their environment and relationships, creating conditions where they would be forced to rebuild their connection on more honest foundations that acknowledged the extent to which power had corrupted their capacity for genuine emotional intimacy. The aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction left Rick and Morty stranded in a reality that might no longer conform to the rules and assumptions that had governed their previous adventures, while also forcing them to confront fundamental questions about identity and meaning that Rick's construction of the dimensional prison had enabled them to avoid through constant action and adventure rather than honest self-reflection about the moral implications of their choices and relationship dynamics. The recognition that their entire shared history had occurred within an artificial context designed to ensure specific outcomes challenged every assumption Morty had developed about personal agency and moral responsibility. Evil Morty's final observations about the inevitability of moral corruption within Rick-dominated realities provided Morty with framework for understanding his own psychological development and the choices that would determine whether he followed similar paths towards systematic cruelty and emotional detachment, or found alternative approaches to managing the knowledge and power that his education had provided. The warning that everyone eventually becomes evil from Rick's perspective was not just philosophical commentary, but practical analysis based on extensive observation of psychological patterns that played out across infinite dimensions with predictable regularity. The philosophical implications of Evil Morty's revelations extended beyond immediate concerns about Rick and Morty's relationship to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism and villainy in contexts where unlimited power made normal moral categories inadequate for evaluating behavior and motivations. While the collapse of the central finite curve eliminated the artificial constraints that had made ethical reasoning seem simple and straightforward by removing alternatives that might have challenged conventional assumptions about right and wrong, the recognition that Rick's protection of his family had required systematic oppression of countless other families across infinite dimensions created moral paradoxes that could not be resolved through conventional ethical frameworks or simple appeals to utilitarian calculations about greater goods and necessary evils. As Morty struggled to process the implications of learning that his entire existence had been predetermined by Rick's psychological needs, and that his moral development had occurred within a context designed to produce specific outcomes while eliminating others, he was forced to confront fundamental questions about free will and personal responsibility that his normal educational environment had never prepared him to address adequately. The challenge of maintaining moral principles and emotional connections in the aftermath of discovering systematic deception and manipulation would test whether the love and wisdom he had developed through his relationship with Rick could survive the revelation that such development had been orchestrated rather than authentic, and whether genuine healing and growth were possible between people whose connection had been built on foundations of cosmic-scale oppression disguised as protection and guidance. The emergence of Morty Smith from the wreckage of the central finite curve's destruction as someone capable of navigating cosmic-scale complexity while maintaining essential human decency represented the culmination of a psychological journey that had tested every assumption about moral development under extreme circumstances. As the young man who had once been defined primarily by his anxiety and social awkwardness had evolved into someone whose wisdom about love and responsibility transcended the nihilistic frameworks that had shaped his education, while somehow avoiding the complete corruption that had characterized most beings' responses to unlimited power and multiversal awareness. The maturation that Morty achieved through years of exposure to Rick's influence was not the cynical detachment that Rick had modeled, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how compassion and moral reasoning could survive and even flourish in contexts where such qualities seemed not just impractical, but actively dangerous for anyone who hoped to protect the people they cared about from the casual cruelty that characterized most advanced civilizations. The competence that Morty displayed in managing interdimensional travel and alien encounters during their post-curve adventures revealed technical skills and strategic thinking that had developed far beyond what anyone should have expected from someone who had begun his cosmic education as a terrified 14-year-old boy struggling with basic social interactions. While his approach to problem-solving demonstrated the successful integration of Rick's analytical methods with moral frameworks that prioritized the welfare of innocent beings over efficiency and convenience, the confidence that Morty brought to navigating complex situations where survival required rapid decision-making about acceptable risks and necessary compromises was tempered by consistent consideration for consequences that affected people outside their immediate circle of concern. The leadership role that Morty gradually assumed in their adventures was not based on superior knowledge or technological capability, but rather on his capacity for understanding human psychology and motivation in ways that enabled him to predict and influence the behavior of beings whose cultural backgrounds and individual experiences differed dramatically from his own limited, Earth-based social education. The diplomatic skills that Morty developed through necessity during their encounters with alien civilizations revealed natural empathy and emotional intelligence that had somehow survived systematic conditioning designed to eliminate such responses as incompatible with multiversal survival requirements. Rick's grudging recognition of Morty's growing capabilities was complicated by his fundamental inability to understand how someone could maintain moral principles while also demonstrating the kind of practical competence that interdimensional adventures required. While his occasional deference to Morty's judgment in situations involving complex relationship dynamics or ethical considerations represented acknowledgement that his grandson had developed forms of wisdom that Rick's own education and experience had never provided. The respect that began characterizing their interactions was mutual but remained asymmetrical, as Morty's appreciation for Rick's knowledge and capabilities was balanced by clear-eyed recognition of his grandfather's limitations and moral blind spots. The adventures, where Morty's approach to complex problems produced better outcomes than Rick's superior technology and analytical thinking could achieve, demonstrated the practical value of maintaining connection to human values and emotional authenticity, even in contexts where such qualities seemed like luxuries that advanced beings could not afford without compromising their effectiveness and survival prospects. The times when Morty's compassion and ethical reasoning provided solutions that Rick's cynicism had dismissed as impossible or naive served as ongoing education for both of them about the relationship between moral intelligence and practical success in situations where understanding, consciousness, and motivation was more important than manipulating physical reality. The philosophical conversations that became a regular feature of their relationship during this period reflected Morty's growing sophistication in ethical reasoning and his capacity for articulating moral positions that could withstand Rick's attempts at intellectual demolition through appeals to cosmic perspective and practical necessity, while also demonstrating his development of frameworks for understanding meaning and purpose that transcended the nihilistic conclusions that Rick had drawn from his own multiversal experiences. The ability that Morty displayed for defending human values against Rick's systematic skepticism required intellectual courage and moral clarity that exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to maintain ethical principles under pressure. But perhaps most importantly, Morty's maturation was characterized not by rejection of Rick or abandonment of their relationship, but rather by insistence that genuine care and love required honest engagement with moral questions and mutual accountability for behavior that affected other people, while his continued loyalty to his grandfather was expressed through willingness to challenge Rick's decisions when they violated principles that Morty had determined were more fundamental than family harmony or personal convenience. The balance that Morty maintained between affection and moral criticism represented sophisticated relationship skills that enabled him to oppose specific actions without rejecting their entire connection. The protective role that Morty began playing in Rick's psychological and moral development was not based on superior wisdom or experience, but rather on his unique position as someone who understood both Rick's capabilities and his vulnerabilities while remaining connected to values and emotional responses that Rick had systematically suppressed through decades of trauma and defensive isolation. The patience and persistence that Morty demonstrated in his efforts to maintain Rick's connection to human decency revealed forms of love that transcended mere emotional attachment to encompass genuine concern for Rick's long-term welfare and moral development. The family dynamics that evolved during this period were characterized by Morty's gradual assumption of responsibility for mediating between Rick's cosmic perspective and the normal human concerns of other family members who lacked the context necessary for understanding the true nature of their adventures and the practical necessities that governed their survival in realities where conventional moral frameworks seemed inadequate for addressing the challenges they faced. The translation services that Morty provided between Rick's nihilistic analyses and his family's need for meaning and connection required sophisticated emotional intelligence and communication skills. The recognition that Rick's resistance to moral authority and emotional connection was itself motivated by trauma and defensive strategies designed to protect him from further psychological damage enabled Morty to approach their relationship with therapeutic understanding that addressed underlying causes rather than simply opposing surface behaviors that violated his ethical principles. The combination of firmness about moral boundaries with compassion for Rick's psychological struggles represented maturity that exceeded what most professional counselors achieved in their efforts to help damaged individuals develop healthier patterns of behavior and relationship. The adventures, where Morty took primary responsibility for mission planning and execution, revealed his development of strategic thinking and tactical capabilities that complemented rather than competed with Rick's technological superiority, while his approach to problem-solving consistently demonstrated consideration for consequences that affected innocent beings who had not chosen to participate in their activities. The moral leadership that Morty provided during these adventures was not based on righteousness or superiority, but rather on consistent application of principles that recognized the inherent worth and dignity of conscious beings regardless of their species, appearance, or ability to reciprocate concern for their welfare. The other family members who witnessed Morty's evolution from anxious teenager into someone capable of managing cosmic-scale responsibilities while maintaining essential human decency began to recognize him as the family member most capable of providing reliable judgment and moral guidance during crises created by Rick's activities or external threats that exceeded normal human capacity for response and resolution. The trust that his family placed in Morty's decisions represented recognition of his unique combination of interdimensional competence and unwavering commitment to protecting people he cared about. The wisdom that Morty developed about human nature and the conditions necessary for psychological welfare enabled him to provide guidance and support for family members whose own development was being affected by exposure to Rick's influence and the extraordinary circumstances that had become routine aspects of their domestic life. While his interventions were characterized by respect for individual autonomy and recognition that healthy relationships required space for people to make their own choices about how to respond to complex circumstances. The counseling that Morty provided was not based on superior knowledge, but rather on consistent demonstration of values that prioritized love and connection over control and manipulation. The philosophical framework that Morty constructed for understanding meaning and purpose in an infinite multiverse was not based on denial of cosmic complexity or retreat into comfortable illusions, but rather on recognition that consciousness and connection possessed significance that transcended mathematical analysis of probability and scale, while his approach to ethical reasoning acknowledged the practical necessities of survival. without allowing such considerations to eliminate moral categories that provided foundation for distinguishing between behavior that deserved respect and actions that violated fundamental principles about the treatment of conscious beings. The peace that Morty achieved with the apparent contradictions between love and moral judgment, between loyalty and accountability, and between acceptance and the need for continued growth and development, represented psychological integration that enabled him to maintain authentic relationships with people whose behavior he found morally objectionable while continuing to care about their welfare and development. The maturity that such an approach required exceeded what most adults achieved in their efforts to balance competing loyalties and maintain connection with family members whose choices they could not approve or support without compromise of their own ethical principles. The confidence that Morty displayed in his own moral reasoning and practical judgment was not based on certainty about complex philosophical questions, but rather on commitment to principles that had proven their worth through consistent application across diverse circumstances and relationship challenges, while his willingness to acknowledge limitations and continue learning demonstrated intellectual humility that complemented rather than compromised his moral authority within family and adventure contexts. The leadership that he provided was characterized by service rather than domination, guidance rather than control, and respect for the autonomy and dignity of everyone affected by his decisions. The recognition that his relationship with Rick represented both his greatest challenge and his most important opportunity for contributing something positive to the multiverse enabled Morty to maintain investment in their connection despite its complexity and moral ambiguity, while his approach to managing their relationship demonstrated understanding that meaningful change occurred through sustained engagement rather than dramatic confrontations or ultimatums that forced binary choices between competing loyalties. The hope that Morty maintained for Rick's continued moral and emotional development was based not on naive optimism, but rather on consistent evidence that love and patience could produce gradual transformation, even in cases where such change seemed impossible, according to conventional psychological theories. As Morty settled into his role as the family member most capable of providing reliable moral guidance and practical leadership during the crises that continued to characterize their existence, he had successfully navigated the transition from passive victim of cosmic-scale manipulation into someone whose wisdom about human nature and ethical reasoning could serve as foundation for healthy relationships and meaningful contribution to the welfare of conscious beings across infinite realities where power and knowledge offered no guarantee of happiness or fulfillment, without the emotional connections and moral principles that made existence valuable, rather than simply endurable, demonstrating that even the most damaged relationships could produce growth and healing when approached with sufficient patience, courage, and commitment to values that transcended immediate practical considerations about survival and success. And so we reach the end of our journey through the extraordinary transformation of Morty Smith, a boy whose evolution from anxious teenager into someone capable of navigating infinite realities while maintaining his essential humanity stands as testament to the resilience of compassion and moral reasoning, even under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The story we have traced together reveals how genuine wisdom develops not through the accumulation of power or knowledge, but through the preservation of empathy and ethical principles in contexts where such qualities seem not just impractical, but actively dangerous for anyone who hopes to survive. The casual cruelties that characterize most advanced civilizations across the multiverse Morty's remarkable journey demonstrates that exposure to cosmic-scale horror and systematic conditioning, designed to eliminate moral reasoning, can paradoxically strengthen, rather than corrupt, the very qualities that make consciousness valuable and relationships meaningful. While his successful resistance to the nihilistic frameworks that transformed Rick into something approaching a cosmic force of destruction, reveals possibilities for psychological development that transcend the apparent inevitability of morale compromise under extreme circumstances. The boy who began his adventures as a passive victim of manipulation evolved into someone whose moral intelligence and emotional authenticity provided solutions to problems that superior technology and analytical thinking could not address. Through conventional applications of power and strategic calculation, the wisdom that Morty achieved through years of confronting ethical complexity that exceeded normal human experience was not based on certainty about abstract philosophical questions, but rather on consistent commitment to principles that recognize the inherent worth and dignity of conscious beings, regardless of their species, appearance, or ability to reciprocate concern for their welfare. The confidence he developed in his own moral reasoning was tempered by intellectual humility and recognition that meaningful relationships required ongoing negotiation and mutual accountability rather than simple adherence to hierarchical structures based on presumed intellectual or technological superiority. Perhaps most significantly, Morty's story reveals how genuine love can coexist with honest moral judgment, and how loyalty to family members can be expressed through willingness to challenge behavior that violates fundamental principles about the treatment of conscious beings. While his relationship with Rick demonstrates that even the most damaged connections can produce growth and healing when approached with sufficient patience, courage, and commitment to values that transcend immediate practical considerations about survival and success. The maturation that Morty achieved was characterized not by rejection of complex relationships, but rather by insistence that authentic care requires engagement with moral questions, rather than simple acceptance of behavior that causes unnecessary suffering. The family bonds that sustained Morty throughout his cosmic education provided him with emotional anchoring and moral guidance that complemented rather than competed with the intellectual and technological capabilities that Rick's adventures had developed. While his success in maintaining connection to ordinary human values and concerns, despite exposure to infinite realities where such values seemed arbitrary and meaningless, reveals possibilities for psychological integration that enable beings to function effectively at cosmic scales without losing essential humanity. The love that connected him to his family members was not weakened by his growing awareness of their limitations and dysfunction, but rather strengthened by his recognition that such love possessed significance that transcended rational evaluation of individual merit or practical usefulness. The hope that Morty maintained for continued moral and emotional development within his family relationships was based not on naive optimism about human nature, but rather on consistent evidence that consciousness and connection possessed resilience that could survive and even flourish under circumstances that seemed designed to destroy empathy and ethical reasoning. While his approach to managing complex loyalties and competing responsibilities demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how genuine care could be expressed through actions that prioritized long-term welfare over immediate comfort or convenience. As you drift toward peaceful rest, let Morty's extraordinary journey remind you that wisdom is not measured by the accumulation of knowledge or power, but by the preservation of compassion and moral reasoning under pressure. That genuine strength lies not in the ability to dominate or manipulate others, but in the courage to maintain ethical principles when doing so requires personal sacrifice or emotional difficulty, and that the most meaningful relationships are not those that provide constant validation, but rather those that challenge us to become better versions of ourselves through honest engagement with moral complexity and mutual accountability for behavior that affects other conscious beings. Rest now in the recognition that, like Morty, you possess within yourself the capacity for moral reasoning and emotional authenticity that can survive whatever challenges existence might present, while the simple human connections you forge each day through acts of kindness and genuine care represent forms of meaning that transcend cosmic scales and mathematical calculations about probability and significance. Sweet dreams in this singular reality where consciousness and compassion remain the most precious resources available to any being capable of recognizing their value and choosing to preserve and cultivate them despite the apparent indifference of an infinite universe that offers unlimited possibilities for both creation and destruction, love and cruelty, wisdom and corruption, but ultimately leaves the choice between these alternatives to the moral intelligence and emotional courage of conscious beings who must decide moment by moment whether existence will be characterized by connection or isolation, growth or stagnation, hope or despair. And so ends our journey through Morty Smith's transformation from anxious teenager to seasoned interdimensional traveler, a boy who learned that growing up means accepting the complexity of the people we love. Morty's story reminds us that resilience isn't about becoming hard or cynical, but about maintaining compassion even when faced with cosmic-scale cruelty and betrayal. Unlike Rick, Morty never lost his capacity for genuine connection or his belief that small acts of kindness matter, even in an infinite multiverse. His greatest strength was never his growing competence with portal guns or alien technology, but his ability to love Rick despite understanding exactly who Rick really was. Not because Rick deserved it, but because love itself has value that transcends worthiness. As you drift towards sleep, remember that Morty's journey teaches us that we can acknowledge the flaws of those we care about without abandoning them. That wisdom sometimes means accepting relationships that aren't perfect but are still meaningful. Rest peacefully, knowing that, like Morty, you can maintain your moral center even when the world around you seems chaotic and senseless. Sweet dreams in this reality where small kindnesses still echo across infinite possibilities,